I believe all 14 members of the committee are present, Senator Case, if you would like to kick off the meeting this morning at your convenience.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I guess we'll start with a roll call since we can figure out where everybody might be.
Senator Baldwin.
Present.
Senator Beitman.
Here.
Senator Driscoll.
Here.
Senator Ellis.
Present.
Representative Blackburn.
Here.
Representative Connolly.
Here.
Representative Dayton Selman.
Here.
Representative Hallinan. Representative Hallinan.
We can see Representative Hallinan. Wave.
Representative Hallinan.
I think
Please mark is here.
Representative Larson.
Here.
Representative Roscoe.
Here.
Representative Sweeney.
Here.
Representative Western.
Here.
Co-chairman Zwanitzer.
Here.
Co-chairman Case.
present. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you with us in these various ways. Just for people that are listening, we do have a live meeting in Lander. So there are people here, and we have Rocky Mountain Power is here, the mayor of Shoshone is here, the Fremont County Assessor Berg is here, Richard Garrett is here from the Nature Conservancy, and Senator Driscoll is with me here. And we have another meeting room in Cheyenne. I don't know if other folks are there, but we appreciate the fact that everybody's working with us to have all these combination of the technical, the Zoom and in-person meetings, so that this is actually the first meeting of the legislature since this all started where we can have some people meet in person, and we're grateful for everyone's cooperation. Please be careful out there. Please be careful here. Any preliminary remarks, Mr. Chairman?
No, Mr. Chairman, but Representative Connolly does.
Representative Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I just got a message that there is a good picture on YouTube, but the sound is not coming through.
Thank you for that. Katie, can we work on the sound? As long as there's a good picture of me, though, I think we're okay. Probably
Well, that's what I said. And honestly, they asked for a little bit more.
Well, we'll do our very best, and I know that staff will get on it. So anything else? Let's go ahead and get started. I see that we have Don Richards on the meeting. Don, last time you were on a Zoom meeting with me. We couldn't hear you for the entire meeting, so I hope it's better today. Take it away. Thank you for being here.
Mr. Chairman, I think my audio is working today. I think we were working with a different software last week. The bugs have been worked out. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Zwanitzer. My name is Don Richards. I serve as the co-chairman of the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group, as well as the LSO Budget Fiscal Administrator. My opening remarks today will be on behalf of the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group. And I have about maybe 20 minutes of discussion regarding a newly released Special Craig report. That Special Craig report should have been emailed to all members of the Joint Revenue Committee meeting this morning, as well as posted both on the committee handouts page, as well as the slider on the LSO webpage. We have a May 26th version of the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group report, as well as an update of the LSO fiscal profile dated with the same date. I believe I'm being joined today by Kevin Hibbard, who serves as the co-chairman of the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group. And I also believe that Dan Noble, former chair, or co-chair of the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group and current Revenue Department Director, is also on the call today. A couple of housekeeping items to begin with. I wanted to acknowledge the Craig members. We met last Tuesday, and staff have worked tirelessly to prepare the Craig report that is before you. I am particularly grateful for their insights, their methods, their reviews, and the contributions. We are finding ourselves in an unprecedented fiscal environment, and I think a theme of this report is a fair bit of humility. We have significantly limited data points. There are numerous unknowable factors. We have changing conditions with respect to the coronavirus, its impacts on health, the economy, consumer behavior, state and federal monetary and fiscal policy, as well as additional challenges. We did implement several new efforts to inform ourselves about the current environment, including looking at epidemiological modeling, and the Wyoming State Geologic Survey also did a robust analysis of several different scenarios of shut-in oil and natural gas wells. Despite these additional steps, I'm under no illusion that the accuracy of this report is likely to be consistent with prior Craig reports. Hopefully it is more than a guess, but a reasoned assessment. I should also mention that this report before you is prepared at the direction of the co-chairman of Craig. We felt it was important to provide policymakers with the best available information. I think it is well known that the January revenue forecast that was released by Craig is no longer applicable. And we elected on our own to substitute that report with the report before you today. At the bottom of page 1, I also add some additional risks. These are always unstated assumptions within Craig, but in this particular environment, they warrant some restatement. That is, we anticipate that the taxes and liabilities and royalty liabilities will in fact be paid. There are numerous scenarios where those may not be paid. For example, the Revenue Department of the state, the Bureau of Land Management, Congress, and bankruptcy settlements could provide and authorize delayed payment, tax or royalty relief, or outright reductions in the liability of taxes, fees, and royalties. That is an assumption that we have not previously had to deal with. So to the extent taxes, royalties, or fees are not paid, those would all reduce our baseline estimates. We also provided 2 additional new features in this 63-page Craig report. Number 1, in section 7, we provide local impacts, both to sales and use tax, the local optional sale and use tax, as well as the local share of the statewide 4% sales and use tax. We also have 2 additional series of appendices at the end of the report. In addition to our baseline estimates, we have included a low revenue scenario as well as a high revenue scenario, recognizing the diversity in potential revenues to be collected over the next 24, 48, and 60 months. With respect to the impacts, there has been a severe reduction in the energy commodity price and production environment, sales and use tax collections, and we anticipate eventually the state's investment yield, that is interest rates. The bottom line is that March 2020 through June 2022, approximately 28 months, Craig anticipates an overall reduction to the general fund budget reserve account revenues over that 28-month period to be $1.1 billion. We also estimate an additional $400 million in reduced revenue for the school foundation program and the school capital construction account. So if you add those together, we're looking at about $1.5 billion in lower revenue in this May 26th report compared to the January 2020 Craig report. Now, when you look at the profile, you will see that 1.5 billion is a little bit lower because there are some offsetting factors. Some of them are rather minor. For example, we received $16.6 million in reversions from school capital construction accounts projects. We're also performing better than anticipated with respect to investment income, which offsets that approximately $88 million. And we also had profiled when you left the session that there would be approximately $90 million deposit into the LSRA in unspent revenue over the course of the 2 biennia. That, of course, will not happen now, but that reduces that $1.5 billion revenue shortfall to a modestly smaller number. Tomorrow and later on today, there is a discussion of the board budget shortfall mechanisms on agenda item number 5. And then early tomorrow morning, agenda item number 12 discusses the state fiscal structure. I'd be happy to discuss some of the more policy implications of the Craig revenue updated in those presentations. But before moving on to the profile, I wanted to discuss some of the key forecast elements that Craig changed. First and foremost, oil production. Our calendar year 2020 forecast for oil production is a decline over our January estimate of 43%. That is coming off of record high production over the last 25 years or so in January and February oil production. So when you add in that robust production in January and February, the 43% decline for the calendar year is actually even worse, 45, 47%, something like that. That is also the biggest area where LSO candidly missed the estimate. We provided some scenarios in April. We provided a base scenario, an optimistic and a pessimistic scenario. If there was one area where we should have changed, it was our anticipated reduction in oil production. We had assumed a baseline of about 20% production, which was twice the all-time high year-over-year reduction in the 1980s that occurred twice. In 2 years in the 1980s, oil production reduced year-over-year by 10%. In April, we doubled that and we thought that would be sufficient. There are now indications that we were woefully wrong. The number of shut-in wells, and we are relying significantly on company reports, informal reports, as Wyoming does not collect the number of shut-ins in a timely manner. Other states, however, that neighbor Wyoming, such as North Dakota, does collect that information, so we benefited from North Dakota's experience. We also reduced our projected price, and we now project calendar year 2020 Wyoming oil price to be $30 per barrel. Now, I know some of you will say, wow, we're not at $30 per barrel today. That is correct, but you also have to keep in mind that we're projecting a calendar year figure, not a daily or monthly figure. In February and in January, we were just shy of $50 per barrel average Wyoming oil price. So you have to factor that into the overall. Certainly, April was horrible for Wyoming oil prices. The average was less than $10 according to our initial information. We believe that there will be some rebound in the oil markets and that over the calendar year average, we anticipate $30. But that's also one of the reasons why we provided that low and high scenario. So if you are thinking that no, 20 or 25 is more likely, that may edge you towards the pessimistic or low revenue scenario that we've included in the appendix. In terms of natural gas, our production estimates have declined 24%. There are no natural gas rigs operating currently in the state of Wyoming. The second largest taxpayer in the state, second largest oil and gas taxpayer in the state, has indeed filed for bankruptcy, although their wells continue to operate. We've also reduced our average price for natural gas to $2.20. Again, this is lower than our January number, which was $2.40 per MCF or MMBTU. In the coal scenario, we have reduced production by 25%. That is slightly more than the current week over week and month over month data that has been provided in April and even early May by the federal government. So we're actually a little bit more pessimistic on coal going forward. We've reduced the price, but only modestly. We've reduced it to $12 per ton from $12.10 per ton, a modest reduction. You should also recall that that is the average Wyoming price, which is an amalgamation of not only the high and low BTU coal values of the Powder River Basin, but the very high BTU coal values in southwestern Wyoming that garner a substantially larger price. With respect to Trona, Trona is perhaps the commodity that is most tied to world GDP, and we have reduced the production there by 25%. It has numerous risks, including synthetic Trona that is facing opportunities due to trade tensions, as well as the lower energy input value for synthetic Trona. In terms of our sales and use forecast, we've reduced the fiscal year, and now we're switching from a calendar year forecast to a fiscal year forecast for sales and use taxes, because the calendar year forecast for commodities is based primarily on the property tax assessment, and then we translate that to monthly values for severance tax. For sales and use tax, it's entirely fiscal year, and we've reduced fiscal year 2020 by 13.9%. That's actually a pretty dramatic decline, because that really is only factoring in the second half of March, April, May, and June. So about 3.5 months reduction of 13.9% is a pretty sizable amount. On top of that, we anticipate a subsequent 30% reduction for fiscal year 2021, beginning with a modest rebound in calendar year 2022. We prepared our sales and use tax estimates using two methodologies. There were separate methodologies. One is our historic forecast model, which uses inputs such as lagged personal income, oil and gas employment, oil and gas production. We then did another sector analysis, which reduced a percentage of sales and use taxes from major industrial sectors such as construction, mining, lodging, and restaurants, retail trade. The 18-month to 30-month projection in total was almost identical in both methods. The timing was a little bit different, and we elected to stick with our typical economic analysis EAD model, which uses the three inputs and historical data. With respect to investment incomes, we're fortunate to have generated $88 million in both realized capital gains from the permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust funds and higher interest and dividends so far in this fiscal year. Craig has a long-standing tradition of not including realized or unrealized capital gains in our estimates. We made a change this time. We are including realized capital gains to date, and the reason being is we're essentially 4 weeks out from the end of the fiscal year. We've talked at length to the state treasurer's office. These gains are not paper gains. They are realized cash gains, and we do not anticipate sizable losses to be taken in the next 4 months. Even if the market goes down, they don't anticipate large sales in the next 4 weeks. So we elected to book those realized capital gains in our forecast. With respect to state royalties, we use the same methodology as severance taxes and federal mineral royalties regarding the production and prices that I previously discussed. We also eliminated all state bonuses for the upcoming fiscal year, as we don't believe that the environment, the State Office of State Lands will hold 3 auctions, or we anticipate they will hold 3 auctions. We do not anticipate sizable bonus payments from those auctions. We've also cut our bonus payments for fiscal year 22 by half. In most all other categories, for a variety of reasons, we made no change. So we made no change to cigarette taxes, liquor taxes, franchise fees, coal lease bonuses, the percent of federal production of coal on federal lands, the percent assessed valuation on oil, all of those myriad, dozens and dozens of other elements of our forecast, we made no change for two reasons. Reason number one, these are rather minor revenue contributions in the grand scheme of things. Maybe $13, $14 million in severance tax is a fraction of what change to the oil or natural gas price does. Secondly, we have little or no information that these various elements will increase or decrease. It's possible that cigarette consumption goes up over the next year or so, or liquor consumption goes up over the next year or so. So we have no data to suggest otherwise, and we left all of those elements alone. Well, what does this mean in terms of the bottom line? It means, as I indicated earlier, that we won't be transferring that $90 million of leftover revenue from the budget reserve account to the LSRA, which was profiled at the end of the March session in 2020. It will also mean, in all likelihood, that the statutory reserve amount, which is $113 million or 5% of the general fund anticipated revenue, will be exhausted before the end of the next biennium. We have one positive highlight. We do not believe on a cash basis or an accrual basis that the state of Wyoming's revenue will go negative by June 30th, 2020. I know that's a low bar for a positive in this environment, but it's an important one. We believe that there will be sufficient cash, and on an accrual basis, that takes us through almost September of 2020. We do not believe that there will have that the state will enjoy cash challenges over this summer. That has significant implications both on the state auditor's office as well as the governor's office. We are benefiting from some higher investment income, as I mentioned, some modest reversions. Now the bad news. You left town with a $202 million transfer from the LSRA to the school foundation program. That grows by another $313 million for a total of $515 million transfer to support the base estimate for K-12 operations. We also have a negative amount, and that's shown on page 1, line 17 of the fiscal profile. We now have a projected negative $877 million balance in the general fund by June 30th of 2022. If you elect to fill that up entirely with the LSRA, and as well as the $25 million negative balance in the school capital construction account, it leaves you with about $70 or so million in the LSRA on June 30th, 2022. Essentially, the LSRA gets wiped out by June 30th, 2022. And you can quibble with the comment that, well, technically we're showing $70 million if we use the LSRA. Yes, but I would refer to the beginning comments. We're in an unprecedented environment. $70 million is a less than 5% error rate on our $1.5 billion revision to our Craig estimate. So that's an error. It's a rounding error in my world. The bottom line is, under fairly what we believe is reasonable assessments, if you do no cuts and no tax increases and use only rainy day funds to shore up the general fund, school foundation program, and school capital construction account, it's essentially wiped out. If, however, you wish to address that with other mechanisms or a collection of other mechanisms, there's a target of about $1 billion to maintain a statutory reserve amount of $113 million on the general fund side, as well as anywhere from $300 to $500 million shortfall on the school side. I should mention that the school side shortfall is also growing. It is comparatively smaller in the upcoming biennium, but the reason for that is because property taxes are delayed. So the real hit on schools occurs in the 23-24 biennium. When not that $500 million shortfall isn't enough, but it grows in subsequent years on the school side. There is a structural disconnect between the state's revenue and expenditures. That structural revenue disconnect has been accelerated since I spoke to the Joint Appropriations Committee in January. The current path is not sustainable. Our Craig estimates may be off, and I indicated that a big theme of this report is humility. We might be off 20% either direction. We might be off 6 months or a year in either direction. I would submit to you that that doesn't matter. The structural fundamental disconnect still remains. It's just a matter of when and how much. 6 months, a year, 5%, 10%, 15% does not change the underlying challenge before the state. The overall trend controls. With that, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'd be happy to respond to questions.
So, Mr. Richards, would it be appropriate to take questions for you now, or should we hear from Mr. Hibbard first, or how do you want to do that?
That would be fine, and I also believe Dan Noble has also joined the meeting.
So are there any burning questions right now? I mean, I know that people have a ton of questions, but it might be good if we hear this whole presentation, if that's all right with people. Okay? Mr. Hibbard, welcome. Are you out there?
Mr. Chairman, you should be able to hear me, and you should be able to broadcast my video. I'm here in Cheyenne. I'd first like to thank everybody, say good morning to Chairman Case and Zwanitzer. I do have a agenda of items to speak to associated with how we can approach the rescissions. That may be better off later after Don has answered questions, and I can get into that because these comments are really kind of focused on how do we proceed once we have an understanding of the shortfall. But it's up to you, Mr. Chairman.
I think we could just proceed. I'm not seeing your video. I'm not sure if that's on your end or our end.
There it goes.
There it is. We see it now. Thank you. Just proceed.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your time today. And as Don introduced me this morning, I am the co-chair of the Craig for the executive branch, and I serve as the director of the state budget department as well. For discussion purposes associated with the Craig, we're going to be using the May 2020 base forecast as presented today by Mr. Richards. I'm going to give you kind of an outline of how we're going to approach the recommendations, how best to proceed. The first thing will be taken care of, and this is certainly up to the governor, and that will be the governor's letter for budget instructions. That letter accompanies the state budget department budget instructions, and we hope to have that out this week or no later than early next week. But again, that's solely up to the governor for that delivery. What are we going to be discussing in that? Just some bullet points. Establish the COVID rescission targets. The rescission targets, I'll talk about a little bit more in detail, but it's important for us to have an understanding. Certainly, we're going to start off with the 877 million, and then we're going to progress in there with some ideas about how we can manage that target. We'll have this, all this work will be done in IBARS. That's the internet tool for budgets here in the state budget departments, and the instructions are ready. We get the governor's letter, associated targets. We can then collaborate with the agencies for possible budget rescissions, programmatic. You've heard the governor on more than one occasion say that, you know, cross-board cuts are more and more difficult as we got lower and lower in the budget world. 2016 was an example where we cut $250 million in 311 positions. We're kind of in the same place today, but the situation is more dire than it was then. Agencies have been asked to review their priorities, and you can go on this Budget Division website and you can see those as submitted to the governor last fall. The agencies have been asked to update those to be balanced with the legislation in this past budget bill. The agencies have accomplished that. We will be posting those shortly on the Budget Division website, and we will also be prepared to give that in an Excel file format to LSO for scenario building. We will work the rescissions from the agencies in June and prepare for rescissions in early, maybe late June or early July. In 2016, we did something similar to this, and we presented to the Joint Appropriations Committee at that time the agency's recommendations for rescissions. We then B11 those funds out of the budget that was presented in the spring of 2016. Similar to this, we are going to reconcile to the budget that was approved by the legislature in the State Auditor Office's WOL system, reconcile to that and apply agency rescissions to that to work the COVID scenarios. We will also follow up, as we did in 2016, with a supplemental budget. That's the opportunity to take another look at the rescissions, have the legislature review those, move them upwards, downwards, or perhaps the duration shortens on COVID, perhaps it lengthens, but we certainly do believe that we'll have better numbers in October. And then as we progress into January, the supplemental budget will be presented and work with the legislature, and we will continue to refine our objective of meeting the expectations of these rescissions. In the supplemental budget, the COVID rescissions will be delineated separately from the supplemental budget requests. So as in 2016, you remember there was a legislation, section 320, we had a column where we put those rescissions in there with narratives so that everybody understood the program cuts, the funding that was going to flow through agencies to constituents, and then ultimately position reductions for the agencies as well. It's important that we do this in IBAR so we get the math calculated properly for the payroll adjustments that take place within a rescission. Don and I have discussed, and we have under consideration a few things like I'd like to point out today, and those are profile considerations, or how do we manage the general fund rescission? First of all, there's a game changer out there for us, and possibly the federal stimulus for the state and local revenue. Perhaps we get some funding. Maybe it's $500 million, we don't know. But that would be a game changer if we did get stimulus. That would help us with our revenue shortfalls. We're going to continue to keep our eyes on that because that would have a significant change in the duration or how we proceed with rescissions for the amounts and the targets. Also, the legislature is aware that we have the 1% severance tax. It's not the $200 million that it was in January. It's more like $103 million today. But we do have the 1% severance tax as consideration of how best we manage the budget shortfall. There's a point that we developed the budget that was presented and ultimately approved by the legislature where we used $128 million in change for major maintenance. That's in general fund. In the governor's letter that he presented, he's already notified the agencies that we're only going to be distributing those funds on a quarterly basis starting in July, but maybe we actually take a look at that severance tax, or excuse me, the major maintenance, and we can act upon that. It's currently generally funded. It's 128 million, but we could use SIPA. On the profile today, you'll see that there's $168 million in SIPA, so we could help ourselves by using some major maintenance. Obviously, there's a consideration that would take place with legislative leadership and the governor of how best to leverage the LISRA, and that is both for the shortfall and the duration. And hopefully, again, the game changer would be possible federal stimulus that would help us along those lines as well. We have been working on an estimate for carryover Right now, I'd hesitate to put out a number for carryover, but it could be upwards to $30 to $40 million that we would anticipate to have from general fund carryover from the BFY 2019 into the 21-22 budget. So we'll work with that as well. Also, clearly in our sight is how we can leverage reimbursements from the CARES Act for expenditures that the state of Wyoming made in the delivery of battling COVID-19 itself. There are state expenditures out there that we've been tracking, and the state auditor's office and A&I Human Resources have developed tracking methodologies, and hopefully we can reach back and start reporting that at least on a quarterly basis so we can understand how much money that we might be able to leverage from CARES Act, as well as other instruments that we're trying to review as we progress in managing the CARES money and how we can best benefit the state of Wyoming. So basically, that's just a framework of how we will approach this. This is certainly up to the governor and legislative leadership about how the final answer is made, but we are collaborating the best we can to come up with a responsible methodology of approach to cover the shortfall that has been represented here today for the general fund. I will answer questions as they come. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Hayward. Committee, shall we go ahead with Dan Noble and then have questions for everyone? It might be most efficient, but if anybody wants to jump in right now. All right, let's go ahead to Mr. Noble. Welcome, Mr. Noble.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. Dan Noble, Director of the Department of Revenue. Committee members, good to see you. I wish I was under better circumstances, but we are in a situation. I'm not going to belabor the issues that have already been addressed as it relates to what Don and Kevin had stated. I kind of want to point to how difficult it is to actually develop any sort of trends when there really aren't any yet. I have 15 days worth of sales tax revenue that I can actually point to that are most likely directly associated with the COVID crisis that we face. This started roughly the middle of March, and we were able to determine that in the middle of that at the end of the March that we were down 12.5% for 15 days worth of revenue in that month. I think Dr. Godby stated it very well when he said you can't really define a trend with one data point. Difficult to do. That being said, I'd say the Craig did a phenomenal job of trying to come up with something that is a reasonable expectation of what we can expect. One of the things that I'll point to is the sales tax forecast. One of the concerns that we've had to deal with in the past is that our sales tax forecast very closely monitored what was going on in the mineral industry, and they were developed based on changes in employment and things like that, and pricing, everything built into that. The thing that is of concern now is we have other factors that are now baked into this, and now one of them being tourism. We have no idea what the impact on tourism is going to be in this upcoming summer. Some events close to home, Shine Frontier Days, we don't know whether that event's going to be held at this point. And even if it is going to be held, is it going to be anywhere what it once was, or is it going to be kind of a shadow of its former self? When you add that into it, and then the impact on retail itself, we're not really terribly comfortable with the estimates that are out there. They could be worse, they could be better. Obviously, I hope they end up better. I think there's any of us out there that would really like to see this end quickly and go back to our normal lives, but such is not the case today. And I think I would say that the Craig has presented you with what we consider to be, and I'm not going to say accurate, but a good projection of what we can expect. I think one of the things you also might want to consider is the fact that federal mineral royalties could very easily be at risk for the state of Wyoming as well, if enough companies go to the feds and are granted relief by the feds, that doesn't affect just the federal government, it affects the state as well. So I want to point those things out. I stand with my brethren on the Craig and recognize that this is an extremely difficult process for the Craig to try to estimate, but also recognize that I think it's realistic. And with that, I'll stand for any questions as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Noble, and thanks to all of you. I would just like to say at the outset that I do appreciate the stress and efforts that have gone into this to produce this forecast, which I think is very well done given our circumstances. So committee, let's go with committee first, and discussions and questions for one or all. Who would like to start? We have Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, quickly, can we talk about the school foundation program and that extra 312 million roughly? Is that coming out of the current LSRA as of right now? And is there any way to reroute that in the next 3 or 4 months? Would be my first question.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Zwanitzer, you're exactly correct. There's a statute that is on the books that directs any shortfall to be made up from the LSRA to the school foundation program. That statute does not cover the school capital construction account. It only covers K-12 operations. Fortunately, we do not believe any of the now projected $515 million transfer will need to occur on or before June 30th, 2020. The entire $500 million will be necessary for the next fiscal year, or next biennium, excuse me. In order to change that, it would require legislative action. The general fund does not enjoy such a backstop. So the $877 million negative balance, if you wish, or if legislators wish to address some or a portion of that or all of that with LSRA, that would require affirmative legislative action and approval by the governor.
Okay, a follow-up, Mr. Chairman?
Absolutely.
And if you could just remind the committee, and I think all the people watching currently online, that $877 million current deficit in the general fund, what percentage of our general fund budget is that for all of state government, roughly?
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Chairman, Chairman Zwanitzer, it's just shy of a third. It's right at 30%. And I do have some slides regarding, I think it's in tomorrow's 8 a.m. presentation, but I'll give a quick preview of that. What is a third of our budget? It's the equivalent of just shy of the entire Department of Health's general fund budget. That's about 1/3. Okay, you don't want to reduce the Department of Transport or Department of Health. It's also the equivalent of all of the state support for higher education. That's the 7 community colleges and UW, 100% of their support, plus 100% of the general fund support for justice. That's all of the courts and the corrections, all of our institutions. So that's another way you could look at a third. One last preview of this is everything else. So you want to fund health fully, corrections and higher education fully. The rest of state government is another third. That's state parks, the Attorney General's office, all of the elected officials, your branch, Department of Administration and Information, that sort of thing. In terms of a line item challenge, $877 million is roughly equal to the biennial personnel costs for all state appropriated employees. Now that does not include higher education because they're on a block grant system, but all state employees that are in the budget, my salary, elected official salary, Department of Family Services, Workforce Services, Health, Corrections, all of that is about 1/3. So that's the type of money we're talking about.
So we could the magnanimity is we could get rid of every state employee, all 8,000 state employees, and that would be roughly where we are?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. So you would be left with the supplies and the contracts and the state payments for Medicaid and SNAP and that sort of thing, but you'd have no one generally funded to administer those services.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Glad you're so cheerful today. Representative Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to kind of follow up on that, but then I do have a couple of questions. To me, I mean, I appreciate you giving us that stark reality of you get rid of every person, but let's face it, the reality is it's not just getting rid of the people. If you don't have people, you can't have a prison. For example, if you don't have people, you're not fixing a road. I mean, if you don't have people, you don't have a foster care system. Let's face it, that's honestly what it means when you get rid of the people who administer those programs, in my mind at least. But I want to ask a couple of questions. They're just clarifying questions. We did talk just a little bit about the 103 million that is the OPSTA. I'm curious if there is any other tips that are going on at the end of the biennium back into permanent funds that would be possible to capture. That's my first question.
Mr. Richards. I think that's for Mr. Richards, right?
Sure, Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly. The one key feature, and it's an anomaly of our spending policy structure, but under our current projections, we do anticipate $44 million to be deposited on or about June 30th, and of course that may take a month or two because of accrual accounting, into the LSRA. $44 million into LSRA, $44 million into SIPA. The SIPA $44 million was guaranteed, so it was going to happen whether or not capital gains were sufficient to cover that. But the LSRA, that is a new deposit to the LSRA that was not previously forecast. Now, the legislature in the next session or in the next general session can do with that what they wish, but under current law, that is an automatic transfer to the LSRA.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Representative.
Thank you. Don, I'm curious about the reserve accounts that we have and the ability to kind of tap into these reserve accounts for the next biennium. Could you address that? Thanks.
Mr. Richards.
Yes, and I actually have a slide on that for a future presentation later in this meeting. But there are really 4 or 5 primary reserve accounts. We've talked about the LSRA. It has $1 billion after you've taken out the automatic transfer for schools. That certainly could be used to address some or all of the shortfall in the general fund. The Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund has a spending policy reserve account, but that spending policy is guaranteed. And essentially, after you pay the guarantee, as shown on page 5 of the fiscal profile, there's only about $30 million left in that reserve that would be available over the next biennium for use. On the school side, there's the Common School Spending Policy Reserve account, and that one would have an additional $125 million available. Another or a fourth reserve is the SIPA account. I believe Mr. Hibbard referenced that in his comments. That has $168 million. He indicated that that could be used, for example, for a portion of major maintenance. There is the School Foundation Program Reserve account. Unfortunately, that is exhausted and has a zero balance after this biennium. So those are the large accessible reserve accounts. Of course, we can talk about others, and I have listed some of those others on a future slide. The Tobacco Trust Fund, even the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund, those take either statutory or constitutional changes to access those funds.
Anything? Go ahead, Representative Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Donna. And I want to just switch to Mr. Hibbard and ask him a question about the governor's letter that is expected to go out regarding budget rescissions. And I'm curious first if the current flex authority that the governor has, if that's sufficient for the kinds of cuts that you were contemplating, and also if those rescissions would be happening immediately, or are they being contemplated for the supplemental budget in January?
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Mr. Hibbert.
I believe the flex authority is adequate, particularly as it was adjusted here recently in the special session. The second question would be on the rescissions. The intent would be that we would work those in June. Now, certainly the governor's letter, when it accompanies the budget instructions, will lay out the process and how we would recommend using those alternatives that we have in place to the extent that we could possibly use those. And that discussion would naturally have to take place with the governor and leadership, and then that would be instructed in the governor's letter. Then, similar to that of 2016, if you recall, in 2016, we met in late June with the Joint Appropriations Committee. We made recommendations from the agencies. We B11'd those dollars away from the agency's budgets, and then we followed up in the supplemental budget. We made some corrections. We accurized the information for positions, et cetera, through the supplemental budget process.
Thank you.
Anything else? Who's next? Who would like to ask questions? Representative Sweeney.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this is probably either for Don or Kevin, and probably Kevin, but you mentioned in your presentation carryover of roughly 40 to 50 million. Do you feel that once you put in the CARES Act dollars into play, will that amount of carryover per department, perhaps, especially Department of Health, increase on carryovers, or can't you really look at it that way?
I think that's for you, Mr. Hibbert.
Mr. Chairman, if a department has spent the money in with their own funding, let's say it's general fund or let's say a special revenue, then we would seek reimbursement. We have a team of individuals. We have a team, it's called the BRAT team. We're working on this. So we would get those reimbursements, and those reimbursements would then flow back to the original source. So if we spent those dollars and they were legally capable of returning them because we use those funds in the actions of battling COVID-19, then we would have those, and then they would come back to the state of Wyoming, but they'd be deposited in the general fund or a special revenue account. As far as the carryover goes, I'll give you an example. Back in 2016, there was a discussion between LSO and the budget division about anticipated carryover. We knew that it was important, and in the beginning, we were hopeful perhaps we get 30 to 40, $50 million. We actually were able to get $80 million of carryover in 2016. And that certainly helped us battle that situation that we're in 2016, and we're looking at that as well. Those two policies that the governor wrote about in his letter about contract freeze and position freeze, those have assisted us. So our anticipated carryover should be growing because we are slowing down the filling of positions and also contract. So hopefully we get a sizable amount of carryover. What we will do is, like we did in 2016, it's going to be all hands on deck. We want to make sure that we seek all the carryover that's possible and use that to where we can assist us in this situation. Certainly the most problematic thing that we discussed in the Craig, and you heard Dan Noble and Don talk about it, our biggest challenge at this point in time is duration. How long is this going to impact us, and how long is it going to take for us to get out? We have to take all those in consideration, but carryovers However, it's certainly going to be one of those things that we're going to chase hard.
Thank you. I've got another question, Mr. Chairman, if
Go ahead.
possible. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Don, you mentioned the bankruptcy situation that we're now starting to see. I think we'll probably, unfortunately, see more. But the first one is a big one. And I haven't been through this before when it relates to the state budget. And in a Chapter 11 filing, are we totally unsecured as the tax collector? And so should we not expect any of those dollars? And is that what you're kind of forecasting?
So, Mr. Richards, if you can, I'm not sure that possibly Mr. Noble might be able to answer that question as well. He's worked on some legislation in the past, but Mr. Richards, if you'd like.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, and I will defer to Director Noble. I think he will be able to provide some additional insights with respect to that. I think each situation is different. The reason I mentioned that at the onset is our current projections do assume that the tax liabilities will be paid. So to the extent that a bankruptcy settlement results in payment of only a fraction or none, that would reduce our revenue forecast accordingly. Now, I think we have been relatively fortunate in the past. In fact, several large companies have gone bankrupt with respect to the state's severance taxes, for example. And those have been reduced in limited circumstances, but generally they have been paid up until maybe recently with some of the coal mine bankruptcies in the past calendar year. Dan can speak to more specifics, but that was our notation of risk, meaning that there is some upside risk, as Kevin indicated, that congressional stimulus may be forthcoming to assist with states' revenue shortfalls, but there's also sizable downside risk. And this would be one of those downside risks that policymakers should, at minimum, keep in the back of their mind.
Mr. Richards, would you mind addressing if you can? I'm sorry, I meant Mr. Noble. Sorry.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. Representative Sweeney, I think one of the misnomers is that we're an unsecured creditor. We are a priority lien holder as it relates to how we approach a bankruptcy. We file a claim once we're aware of the bankruptcy being initiated, and we're placed in line with all the other creditors as it relates to when their liens were filed and when they were perfected. Do we have a super priority as it relates to any of that? No, we do not, and not at this point. There is some legislation going through, or that went through this last year, that kind of helps on the local level as it relates to some of that. But it is something that a bankruptcy, and a lot of that depends on the type of bankruptcy. I believe the ones that were recently filed were Chapter 11, which means they're trying to reorganize the debt structure of the organization to make them, if you will, leaner coming out and more able to continue business. They are still continuing to operate, and they are not delinquent on their severance taxes to this point. But it is something that it puts us at risk, obviously. It is something that we deal with not only in mineral severance, but on a daily basis. We deal with it in the sales tax realm. And you will probably see an increase on that side as well. Retail has been hurt by this, and you will probably see some retail bankruptcies as well. Just recognize that, yes, it does put us at risk, but we are not an unsecured creditor. We actually have liens like any other bank or anything like that. A lot of it just depends on when we file.
And I believe we have a lien on future production. So which is a good place to be. Back to you, Representative Sweeney.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Would any other members of the committee like to ask questions of the panel? Dr. Hallinan, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The 500 million that Don mentioned is going to go from the LSRA to the school foundation program. I wonder if that is understood by the local school districts yet, because Campbell County recently voted to increase the salary of all their employees next year. So is there a way that this amount can be reduced, or is it something that might increase based on these kind of salary decisions made by our school districts?
Who wants to jump onto that one?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hallinan, the decisions by local school districts do not have any direct impact on the formula that the legislature has approved to provide a block grant to those school districts. How they spend that block grant is a local decision. The legislature certainly has an opportunity to modify that formula. And I would remind the committee that you are actually undergoing a recalibration process, have a special committee and consultants for that this summer, this interim. But to reduce the formula for K-12 would require, again, affirmative legislative action, a bill that is also either signed or at least not vetoed by the governor.
Thank you, Mr. Richards. Any follow-up, Dr. Hallinan?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Anybody else, please? Anybody else? Oh, Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I wondered if we can get the data of how many school districts actually are doing that. Mine also did that in Park County 1. They also did a stipend. That doesn't look so favorable when we're in such a short of money. But anyway, can we get a tally of all the districts that have done that throughout the state?
So I'm not sure that that could come out of this panel here. I think we could explore that with our friends on the Education Committee and possibly, but Don, would you have any idea how we go about getting that?
Mr. Chairman, there is a standard report that comes out every fall that illustrates the increase in actual salaries and compensation packages for each of the 48 school districts. That's a standard approach. We could, if it is the committee's desire, do a special informal survey through the Department of Education and make a interim request in the month of June if the September-October report is not sufficient.
Thank you, Mr. Richards. So we could do that. Who else has a question? Anybody else? Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can we talk a little bit about the Federal CARES Act and the money coming into the state? It's about 1.25 billion. As I understand it, a lot of that funding is going directly to businesses, but not really going at all to government. Certainly not necessarily going to make up city or county or state government budgets or education budget. And so roughly a little less than 1 out of every 5 jobs in the state is related to government, either through education, higher education, city, county, state, federal. Can we talk, and I've been getting a lot of these emails about, hey, all this CARES Act money is coming in. You know, that's how we can use this money to fix Wyoming's budget problems. Can we talk a little bit about how much of that actual money from the CARES Act can be used to supplement or help out or mitigate the financial losses to government or education in Wyoming? And I don't know if Don would know that some of that information off the top of his head or not.
Who would like to address that? I'm not sure that Don's getting the pounded a lot.
Mr. Chairman, and I'd happy to turn it over to Kevin after some brief remarks.
Okay.
Currently, the federal law does not allow for states or local governments to use CARES Act funding to backfill declines in revenue or revenue shortfalls. That's not a permitted use. That's not to say that there are not, in fact, there's a bill at the desk in the United States Senate that would change those requirements, but under the current federal law, that is not an option. In terms of direct payments, you'll recall there was about $340 million adopted in the special session that support landlord-tenant programs, small business PPE programs, stipend programs for those businesses that have been affected. The other funds, let's call it maybe $850 million, can be used for a whole swath of priorities that were adopted by the legislature, including hospitals and healthcare centers, local governments, state government, but they have explicit purposes for which those funds must be used. So, for example, the state can use a portion of those funds for the direct COVID-19 response. That's first line workers, potentially some assistance with our National Guard, Homeland Security, Highway Patrol, first responders in sheriffs, municipal police, county health offices, procurement of equipment, procurement of protective materials, personal protective equipment. There is some opportunity to use it for wider purposes, broadband, some infrastructure, some limited capital construction, but that does not necessarily offset current state or local government expenditures. I think Mr. Hubbard mentioned that some of that could be. So for example, your special session that was requested in a forum with the Department of Treasury, whether or not states could use those funds to assist with legislative costs of special sessions, and the Department of Treasury verbally indicated that was a permissible use. So you might get some, fraction of staff salary applied to that. Mr. Hibbard may offer more.
Go ahead, Mr. Hibbard. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, to support Don and his comments, expenditures associated with the mitigation of COVID-19 can be reimbursed if the state of Wyoming experienced an expenditure and it was to mitigate COVID-19. We can seek reimbursement for it as long as it wasn't previously budgeted. Now, I'm not aware of anything that we put in our budget in the recent session that was directly COVID related, but we can't supplant, so we have to follow through with our budget plan. But we can look at the expenditures that the state of Wyoming has spent in a look back fashion to see if we have spent general funds or special revenue funding that qualifies for the mitigation of COVID related expenditures, and then get those or seek to have those reimbursed. And we're doing that to the greatest extent possible that we are capable of doing right now. And that would include the conversation that Don had about the cost of special sessions. We would process those as well. Those decisions ultimately will get qualified, approved in writing by the AG once we collaborate with the SAO and the agencies to find those expenditures, get them approved, and then seek reimbursement for them. But that's pretty much where we're limited to now until such time as we get the game changer that I talked about. And that would be a stimulus package from Congress that would allow us to have some revenue to help us with our revenue shortfalls, both on a state and local level.
Thank you, Mr. Hibbard. Anything else from the committee? Anything else? Anybody? Oh, got lots. Okay, let's go first time, Representative Roscoe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just wondering if we do decide to dip into our reserve accounts, SIPA and Common School Fund, how would that affect our investment revenue? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Richards, I think throw that at you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Roscoe, excellent question, and we recognize the report was just sent to you this morning, but we do touch on that in the report. In fact, any reduction in the corpus of the reserve accounts will reduce our investment income going forward. So for example, If the $1 billion balance of the LSRA is expended, those funds would no longer be available in fiscal year 23-24 to generate investment income for the benefit of the general fund. However, the reduction is actually quite small because the current interest rates that are projected in calendar year 2022 are extraordinarily modest, given the 10-year is trading at about 2/3 of 1 percentage point. It's certainly money, you know, it's maybe $10-15 million of potential interest earnings, but it's not the $100 million that we have enjoyed off of investment income from those reserve accounts in prior years.
Let's go to Representative Conley. You were next, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two follow-up questions, one for Don and one for Kevin. So let me start with Kevin. You talked about kind of hoping for the $500 million in an additional stimulus. And in fact, we all do. I mean, there's no two ways about it. So first, could you talk a little bit about your thoughts regarding the possibility or probability of that money coming in? But also, do you have the recognition that in no way does that solve our problem? That we, in fact, even if that money comes in, fingers crossed, we need to do something about our revenue structure as we go forward. And so that's my question for Kevin, and then I have another one for Don. Thank you.
Mr. Hibbert.
Mr. Chairman, yes, we are hopeful. The House has passed the bill. I don't have any opinion on how it'll finally wrap up, but we're hopeful that we would get some stimulus money to help both the state and local governments with the loss of revenue. I look at it as this problem. I think you heard Don and Dan discuss the duration and the struggles that we have with properly calculating what our revenue streams will look like depending on what duration we choose. Certainly, if we were to receive stimulus from Congress, it would help us in our calculations and our methodology of how we best address the duration of COVID-19 in relationship with the LISR and the other options that we put on the table and discussed today. I think that it would be very helpful for duration.
Thank you, Mr. Hibbert. Go ahead, Representative Conley, with your question for Don.
Don, thank you. Two follow-ups. I had asked you before about the OPSTA and the 1%. I'm curious if that tips. But on a broader kind of question, going back to the one about general fund versus school foundation, can you talk a little bit about the relationship of the deficits in those accounts to numbers of employees? I mean, aren't we seeing kind of that disproportion in terms of the deficit and the number of employees that are funded by the general fund and school foundation?
Mr. Richards, if you can.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, with respect to the 1% severance tax, that was adopted by the Joint Appropriations Committee in your 2020 budget. And that is, those funds previously were anticipated, as Kevin indicated, at about $100 million per year. We've reduced that down to about a little over $50 million per year. So it's about cut in half, $103 million for the biennium. There is an automatic tip associated with that, but that tip occurs after, by design, after the general session. So it allows the legislature to come back if you wish to change that tip or change the distribution. Right now it's 50% into the LSRA, 50% into the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund Reserve account, Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund account. So it's a 50-50 split, which would be about $25–26 million into each account, and that occurs after the session.
Mr. Chairman, just as a follow-up to this question, Don, would we then be able to, in a special session, for example, kind of capture that before it would tip to the permanent fund? Would we need to have a bill in order to capture that before it becomes permanent or tips into the permanent?
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, you would require legislation that could come in the form of a supplemental budget or a standalone bill. It could come in the form of a special session, or it could occur at the 2021 general session. I wanted to touch just briefly on your question, if I might, to Kevin. As he indicated, the House has adopted stimulus legislation. I'm not under any illusion that the Senate will adopt the same legislation. I think the Senate Majority Leader has indicated that is not the case. Nonetheless, we have calculated what that House version would mean for the state of Wyoming. And it is, again, pretty extraordinary. It's in excess of $1.1 billion in calendar year 2020, and an additional $1.1 billion in calendar year 2021. So it's well in excess of $2 billion in the House legislation. So when Kevin mentions maybe there's 500 million, he's, knocking off 75% of the House bill, just to give you a sense of the numbers that are being discussed at the federal level. Your last question of me, I may need some additional direction. You asked about the disconnect between the size of the deficit and the employees. And I'm not sure I understand the intent behind that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Richards. We're starting to go kind of down a road of thinking about kind of the school accounts and the employees as different from the general fund. And actually there was some kind of conversation about some of the increase in pay. And so I just wanted to kind of clarify a little bit about the deficit that we have in each of those accounts and the number of employees that are associated with each of those really broad accounts. The general fund, which is everything but education and UW, and then school foundation. Because again, and I think it was Co-Chairman Zwanitzer pointed out that we have 1 out of 5, if not even more than that, of employees in the state are in some way employed by government, whether it be schools, the state, etc. So just to get a better sense of those numbers.
Mr. Richards, if you will.
Thank you for the clarification. As I indicated in the presentation, the current shortfall on the K-12 side is smaller, and that is largely because it does not, it receives a lot more money from property taxes and investment income, both of which are, the immediate impact is on a smaller scale, as opposed to the general fund, which benefits more from severance taxes and sales and use taxes, which have a, immediate impact within a month or two of the COVID virus impacts on the broader economy. So on the K-12 side, looking forward to the next biennium, that $500 million shortfall is roughly 17% of its entire budget. However, the K-12 budget, as I think you're alluding to, has, number one, a lot more FTE associated with it than the state side. There are approximately 18,000, maybe 17,500 K-12 employees. That ranges from custodians to food workers to principals, teachers, administration. About 80% of that $3 billion K-12 funding is directly associated with compensation for public employees. So that's kind of the ratio there, a 17% cut, but it's on 80% funded employees. On the general fund side, it's about double the amount of the cuts because it's more immediate impact on that sales and use tax and severance tax. So it's about a 30% hit to the general fund net. But the general fund does not have 80% funding of employees. It's more along the lines of a third, maybe 33% of true state employees. A large portion of the general fund is paid out in the form of grants, service provision to vendors, whether that is healthcare vendors or group home vendors or vendors for the developmental, vendors providing services to individuals with developmental disabilities. It's payments to local governments. It's not necessarily in the form of state employees.
Okay,
I hope that helps provide context.
thank you. We'll go to Representative Sweeney, and I just want to, according to our schedule, which we don't have to follow, but we're getting close to 10 o'clock, and we do want to get some public comment in and let the public ask questions too. So, Representative Sweeney, I believe you were next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think this is probably to Don, but I think we've got three in their individual offices. They're the smartest guys in the room, in their room. So, but one of the things that has come out of the Management Council for Revenue to review is number one, review Wyoming's financial situation, which I think we're doing today, and then address revenue shortfalls. So is it appropriate, or would Management Council have to ask the three of you for your opinions on potential legislation, or can Revenue Committee ask your opinion? Because you guys deal with this every day, we don't. In my opinion, is there potential legislation for this second session that we should consider during this meeting, in your opinion? And if that was a totally inappropriate question, Mr. Chairman, you can definitely say, let's move on.
Well, Representative Sweeney, I'm not about to go there. If the gentlemen want to speculate, you're welcome to. If you don't want to, you don't have to. So, Don, we can start with you. You seem to be on the hot seat the most.
Mr. Chairman, as I'll preface this with LSO staff, we have no opinion on any proposed legislation. If the legislature elects to address this in one way or the other, that is their prerogative, and we are stand ready and able to draft and assess that legislation. I will comment broadly on 2 points. Number one, timing matters. Even if we're off by 50%, the earlier you start eating this elephant one bite at a time, the easier it will be. If you have $500 million, let's say the Craig estimates are off by half. It's not $1 billion shortfall, it's $500 million shortfall. If you spread that out over 12 months, it is substantially harder than if you spread it out over 24 or 25 months. So timing does matter. Timing matters when you consider using reductions, budget reductions. How you spread that over time has a significant impact. It also addresses on the tax side. If any member prefers to address a portion of the revenue shortfall with revenue increases, or excuse me, the budget shortfall with revenue increases, timing matters. Many tax proposals won't generate any additional revenue in time to address this. Let's take an example of increasing property taxes. That's delayed significantly after you impose a mill, say on January 1, calendar year 2021. We're talking about fiscal year 2022 before the state benefits from that increased tax. So timing matters, regardless of which approach you use. Use of reserves, budget reductions, or increase in taxes or revenue in one form or another. The second thing I would say is it will be challenging to address this with any single approach. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I've described in my introductory remarks, if you desire to use only the rainy day fund, it exhausts essentially the entire rainy day fund over the next 2 years. If you elect to use entirely budget reductions, again, I've discussed generally what that means with respect to the services provided by government. At the same time, if you intend to address this with entirely taxes, you're talking about mill levies and doubling of sales and use taxes that I don't think any prior legislature has really contemplated at this time. I'm not saying it's impossible, I'm just saying it is at a level which has not previously been discussed in at least open forums that I have been privy to. So addressing this with any single lever has challenges of its own. I'm not advocating for one or the other. I'm just trying to articulate what that would look like if you selected just one lever. With that, I'll pause.
So, Mr. Richards, I think that was very well played, and thank you for that. The question was also directed to the other members of the CREG. I don't know if anybody wants to weigh in. I do think it's been pretty well covered. I might tag on to that a little bit. I do think, Representative Sweeney, that there's some universality in the thinking that Wyoming's tax structure, which has served us well for a very long time, is under increasing stress as we go forward in this new environment, especially in a world where carbon production is really frowned on. And so I think, I'm not trying to put words in the panel's mouth, but I would ask if anyone would challenge the notion that we do need some kind of restructuring of our tax system on looking at things over the long term. So I don't see anybody biting on that one. Representative Sweeney, you had a follow-up.
I do. Would the quickest tax increase, would Mr. Noble, if during the special session we were willing to look at a 1% sales tax increase statewide, which would generate, well, it used to generate an estimated 200 million per year, and that estimate is probably down to maybe 140 million at this point. But could we stand that up July 1st if we took action at the special session?
Mr. Noble.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, we could put it in place July 1. However, it would not become effective for vendors to begin collecting because we have to give them notice to adjust our systems. It would probably, the earliest you could put it in place would be October 1st. There's minimal administrative burden associated with doing that, but it is a notice requirement, and statutorily required, we are required to give vendors 60 days notice prior to implementing a new tax rate. And in addition to that, we are required to I lost my train of thought. We're talking about vendors all over the country, so we require that, and it has to happen. I remembered it. It has to happen at the beginning of a calendar quarter, so you're not looking. We did that so that vendors don't have to look every single day to see when a tax rate goes up.
Thank you, Mr. Noble. So committee, we've had a lot of questions, good questions. There are members of the public that I believe wish to testify. We should, if there's nothing else from the committee, can we see? Mr. Co-Chairman, is there anybody in Cheyenne?
Mr. Chairman, no one who wishes to testify at this time.
Okay, I'm going to check Lander. Anybody in Lander wish to testify? We're good in Lander. How about with the waiting room? Dr. Hallinan, I see your lips moving. I'm trying to unmute you, but I'm not having much luck. Ms. Talbot?
Mr. Chairman?
There you go, Doctor.
Yeah. In view of the fact that this is a temporary shortage, I believe it's temporary, funds that we have, and in view of the extremely low interest rates we now have to pay, would it not be reasonable to consider a loan for part of this money that we're short? Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hallinan. I think we'll be able to talk policy as we go forward. We certainly are the Revenue Committee. We're not the Appropriations Committee, so we're looking at options to in partnership with our friends on appropriation and throughout the legislature that want to achieve cuts, and I want to achieve cuts too. And my emails just go all the time, cut, cut, cut. But we are the Revenue Committee. A solution to revenue issues might be borrowing, issuing bonds, various things. And I guess we'll get our chance to talk about those later. It certainly is a favorable climate for that, perhaps. But my own speculation would be, just like a lot of other things are going to be clear as we move forward through the summer, maybe that option also would become clear and certainly should be explored. Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just trying to put it in perspective because yes, this is a projection decrease for the next 2 years, but we were already having long-term revenue problems we can certainly talk about later. But I'm trying to put it kind of numerically because by the time we instituted a property tax or corporate income tax or any type of those type of taxation methods, really, I think the only immediate for the next year or two to get us through if we're not going to spend down the LSRA would be a sales tax. And so I'm quickly crunching the numbers and I just want someone to either agree or disagree with me. At our current sales tax rate, to cover the deficit that we're expected to face the next 2 years, I'm calculating that at roughly an 8-cent sales tax increase. If we were just to cover this with sales taxes, would that, I don't know if Director Noble or Don could say that's close, but if we were just going to try to tax our rate out of this, to put it out to members of Wyoming to say, here's the hole we're in, is an immediate 8-cent sales tax increase about on target at the level of distress we're at?
So who wants to handle?
I'll-
Mr. Noble, let's go to you first.
I'll address it first. I think it's a combination of two things. First of all, it would have to be increased substantially, several percentage points in order to cover it all, if you will. I'm not going to say 8% is right. There's two factors. Number one, what happens to the GDP if it continues? If we're dealing with 30% less to tax, then the rate becomes higher to reach an equilibrium. Is it going to be the only way that you could actually do that? I think it would probably create a situation that probably would be untenable in and of itself. I think you'd have to look at other revenue choices. I understand that there's a need to look at trying to address this quickly, but I don't think you're going to do it strictly with sales tax. And that's obviously my opinion.
Sure, thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Okay, thank you. It is clear though, what's required is significant. Representative Conley, are you trying to tell me something? I'm sorry. It's more than significant, it's huge. And I suppose we've been talking about making tough decisions for a long time. It probably is time to start thinking about these decisions in a very real way and moving forward. And I know that a lot of people will hear, well, maybe the federal government's going to bail us out, and I suppose that's possible. I'd be grateful if they did, I suppose. But that has its own consequences and is also time limited. So I just put that on the table. Do we have anybody on the Zoom platform in the waiting room or whoever that'd like to address the committee at this time?
Mr. Chairman, there's no one in the waiting room.
Okay, so I think we've come to a good place to take a break. And when we come back from our break, let's see, I'm showing 10:08. Let's come back at 10:25. And we will pick up and we will hear from the governor's office. Thank you very much, committee. Great questions. Thank you very much, Craig members. These are indeed serious times. Thank you. Representative Conley, I trust your judgment. So the next item on our agenda is to hear from the governor's office and with respect to their efforts in Power Wyoming. So I think I need to admit someone. That's probably what I need to do. I see the Chief of Staff.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning, Mr. McVeigh. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you, and how's everyone on the committee?
I think all of us agree that there's never been a better time to be on the Revenue Committee.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. Well,
So, how are you doing things on your end?
we're doing well, thank you. We're doing well. We're sad we couldn't join you in lovely Lander today, but this is as good as it gets.
So are you the only presenter? You're the only one I see.
Actually, Mr. Chairman, Director of Policy, Rennie McKay, will be presenting as well.
Okay. We turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Joint Revenue Committee. My name is Buck McVeigh, and I am the Chief of Staff for Governor Mark Gordon. Pleasure to be with you today to talk with you about the governor's early initiative, really, that's now known as Power Wyoming. Excuse me. And really this, I want to talk a little bit about the whole concept of how Power Wyoming came about. There's been various efforts over the years, those of the executive branch, those of the legislative branch, to discuss revenue scenarios, revenue situations, but it was always either one side or the other. So the governor's objective here was to create this team, if you will, along the lines of a more collaborative, cooperative effort between the two branches, knowing that we are facing some serious issues with our state's revenue, and this was way before the COVID-19 pandemic became an issue for us. Power Wyoming is a topic we discussed last year on several occasions. I attended a revenue meeting in Lander where I presented to the committee, and excuse me, and Director Rennie McKay has presented to the committee after that as well. But I wanted to point out one of the early goals of Power Wyoming has been really to help us better understand the challenges and trends in energy production and their impacts on revenue collections for the state of Wyoming. A second goal of Power Wyoming is to develop a communication component. And this has been kind of the big thing for me in my involvement with this group. The communication component would be to better inform decision makers, yourselves, and further communicate with the public about the complexities and financial hurdles that are impacting the state currently and those into the future as well. And then the third major goal is to develop ideas for opportunities to make Wyoming as resilient as possible into the future with a strong, diverse, and revenue-generating economy. It's important to note, though, Mr. Chairman, that the Power Wyoming will not be charged with deciding on cuts to state government. But I also want to point out that the Gordon administration has already done a lot to slow the spending within our state agencies and plan for the next biennium. We look forward to updating this committee on those efforts, which Policy Director Rennie McKay will go over in more detail here shortly. But these efforts are now going to ramp up significantly now that we have heard this update from the Craig, which, by the way, I just want to commend those members on the extensive and unbelievable challenge before them in trying to forecast or predict, or better yet, guess what our revenue scenarios are going to be down the road. And I think as both co-chairs of the Craig indicated, going into this thing, it's just now truly a dark board. The data that we had come to depend upon now are all obsolete. Data points are now starting over with this COVID problem. And I think more importantly, to the problem of trying to pinpoint where our revenues are going to be now and in the near term, I think the big question of the duration of this shortfall and the world that we know right now is going to be the toughest thing to try to factor into our revenue equation. So the governor had issued his budget preparedness letter that was sent out to state agencies on April 14th. And this was to kind of give them a taste of the severity coming down. It was really their first sense of what's looming, and we didn't have any idea of the magnitude of the revenue scenario until just today. So the governor did institute a position freeze, a halt on general fund contracts of $100,000 or greater, and has implemented a rigorous review of the quarterly distributions for major maintenance that Director Hibbard was talking about as well. So clearly, we know that cuts are coming in the coming months, and coordination between your committee and our office to understand the scale and options is going to be absolutely essential. I'm interested in following today's discussion. You got a very busy schedule, very involved schedule with. I'm very familiar with the situation that you're discussing. We've been through a lot of these discussions before, but I don't think with quite the urgency and the impacts that we're now facing. So I'm very interested to listen and engage with you today. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I'm going to turn the next portion of this presentation over to Director Rennie McKay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McVeigh. Go ahead, Mr. McKay.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much again, Rennie McKay, Governor Gordon's Policy Director. And I'll just dive into a little bit more detail on Power Wyoming and where we've been and where we're headed. So I spoke to all of you during the last interim and went over some revenue scenarios that went further into the future than the standard Craig forecast. And those were produced by the University of Wyoming, working with the State Division of Economic Analysis. So I felt like that was a very good discussion. Appreciated your time and appreciate again the opportunity to be here. So again, we're looking at future energy production and how that impacts the future funding of state government. I think you'll remember, and we'll look at this in 1 second if somebody wants to get the slide ready, but we were looking at a range of scenarios. So there was a best case, a worst case, and a reference case there in the middle. It was what we presented. And one of the things that was said to all of you was that what we know about modeling is that it's always wrong. So that was proven up. And so again, the reason we're here is because the Governor Gordon wanted to start last year this discussion because he saw that trouble brewing even back then. So you can see the 2019, that's the total energy mineral revenue on the left that we were looking at together last year. There was an update on the right, and that's the 2020 from January of 2020. So again, what the governor's idea really behind having this done was so that we would all have a shared sense and ability to start talking about how we needed to manage the coming years, recognizing the challenges lurked. That scenario on the left was not a good scenario. The scenario on the right is one where things got even worse. These came from the Energy Information Administration of the federal government, and so federal economists put together the scenarios related to the energy production, and then our folks here in the state took that and how that impacted revenue. So what you can see there is that between 2019 and January 2020, we went from a situation where the best case scenario in 2020, the one on the right, was essentially worse than the most dire scenario in 2019. And that was in January. So I don't need to go into this in much detail, but we all know that we would love to have that scenario on the right back if we could, because that would be a lot better than where we are today. So what we discussed last year was that Wyoming was going to have 3 legs on our main economic revenue generating engine, and that's those legs are energy, coal, natural gas, and oil. And then the future seemed to put us more on one leg, and that was oil. And unfortunately, that leg got kicked out from under us through this crisis. So that puts us in the situation we're in right now. We don't have updated forecasts or scenarios for you today, because again, we don't have the data points to do anything that would be sound, but we do know that that scenario on the right that was done in January would be an awfully good scenario of that. In January, we did have oil in Wyoming almost at $50 a barrel. So fortunately, we've all started thinking about this previously. We've discussed options. Well, what's happened is the pace has accelerated. And I think that changes the dynamic of Power Wyoming. So the governor's going to really appreciate hearing from all of you today and the ideas that you'll discuss, talking about what programs we need and the scale of cuts that are required. I've already heard some that discussion of scale. And I think that's very necessary for everyone to understand what we're facing if we're looking at the scale of cuts or we're looking at the scale of revenue increases. So what Power Wyoming will do is we're not going to have that group discuss what cuts are necessary. The Power Wyoming governor wants that group to look a little further out in the future, but hopefully it will help all of you, and it will help obviously the governor as well. So one of the main topics we're going to be going through is an analysis of what best positions us to come out of this crisis and grow the economy. That's going to be working with the Business Council, UW, the private sector to evaluate changing trends. We're all obviously on a Zoom meeting, we're seeing these trends. What trends are going to happen with travel? What trends are going to happen with power usage? What trends are going to happen with remote working in the long term nationally and globally? What do those do for our options and our strategy? So we can look at a menu of options and analyze those, provide that analysis to decision makers like all of you. And then essential to that, as Chief McVeigh said, we've got to do a lot of communication work to talk about this widely so that people understand the scale that was just brought up again this morning and start thinking about what's next. And we've got to do it fairly urgently. So we're going to be involving as many people as possible over the coming months from across Wyoming, from across sectors and businesses. And we had a great start of that in January with a trip to Powell. I want to thank the local economic development agency in Powell and Wyoming Business Alliance for helping facilitate that. That's the kind of model we can use to further this discussion. And we hope that we'll also be back in front of you to update you on the progress over the interim of Power Wyoming. So the governor is tasking us to be very busy on that front. And on a lot of other fronts. So there's going to be the planning with Power Wyoming. There's going to be managing the budget crisis we face. There's going to be administering the $1.25 billion in CARES Act dollars, including the millions and millions of dollars that are outside of that 1.25 that are coming to Wyoming in different ways. We've seen that already $1 billion in loans came to Wyoming businesses through the Paycheck Protection Program, and millions of dollars have gone to hospitals already, millions of dollars are going to airports. These are all outside of that 1.25 billion. So there is a lot to manage. Really appreciate working with all of you, and any questions you have going forward, we look forward to answering.
Any questions from the committee? Anybody? Representative Conley, then Sweeney. That's a classic team.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, just let me say thank you to the governor's office, and it's nice to see you. And I appreciate your task force and that you're managing and actually have done a tremendous amount of work over the past couple of months. But I'm going to ask about leadership from the governor's office. You know, this is a committee that did the real hard work last interim, kind of recognizing that we have a changing economy. And we passed a series of bills that were really hard for many people on the committee, you know, whether it be Medicaid expansion, sales tax, or corporate income tax, taxing services, lodging tax. I mean, we did that hard work. And honestly, from the governor's office, we saw support for the lodging tax, and that was about it. And I'm curious about the leadership that we will have, and honestly, that we need from the governor's office as we move forward through the interim, because we can't do it alone. We need to have a partnership with the governor's office in order to solve the problem.
Sorry, I was on mute. Anybody like to respond? It was a little bit of a political question. I will, but certainly welcome to respond.
Mr. Chairman, if I may make it into I'll make it into a question for the governor's office. And it is, you know, have you considered at this point about the need for revenue and which directions the governor's office is most interested in pursuing?
I think that was a little better, Representative Conley. Thank you so much.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conley, thank you for that question. It's an extremely good question. First of all, I want to just say that we understand that cuts, budget reductions and cuts are really they're a reaction to the problem, and it's not a solution to the problem or a solution to fix the problem. So yes, we do recognize the state's current revenue structure is flawed, and I believe it was Chairman Case's point, it's worked marvelous for us through the years. We've had the ups and downs as we would with a structure that's dependent on the energy sources as we have here. And I know that we've had many discussions before about taxes. I think I can speak broadly for this office in the fact that we understand that the revenue structure that we've known and that we've lived under historically up to now is not going to get us through going forward. So with that, we are actively engaged in this office in looking at creativity at its best, creativity in budgeting, creativity, open-mindedness in terms of additional taxes and revenue-raising measures moving forward. Specifically, we have not talked about anything, but I will tell you this, broad-based taxation is probably the most palatable at this juncture. So we'd be looking at, be interested in following your committee's discussion moving forward on things about our current sales and use tax scenario, but understanding too that we don't have the commerce, we don't have the economic activity that we once did, specifically in the mineral sector that has been the largest generating component of our sale and use tax. So we have to be open-minded. We have to be committed to this discussion with you moving forward. And I will say flat out, I don't think anything's off the table. Is that a good way to skate around the issue there, Mr. Chairman?
Conley, would you like some follow-up?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Buck.
Thank you, Representative Conley and Buck. Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'd like to zero that in a little bit and appreciate the task force hard work and the governor's hard work that will continue on, obviously, for next couple of years, most likely. But I'd like to talk and ask a question on your consideration at looking at things on Medicaid expansion. And I'm to understand that we can't use CARES Act money because that federal match, it is not applicable for that particular program. But I'd ask you, because of C-19, obviously businesses have had to close that were either ordered by the federal, mostly because of the federal government. That created less energy consumed. And a number of factors took on our energy industry, but my contention is because of less energy consumed. Our extractive industries obviously laid a ton of people off, and we saw closures. So that led to employee benefits possibly lost across all sectors. So my ask is, have you considered going back and saying, number one, Wyoming has never chosen to expand Medicaid, so we're in kind of a unique position. And that there is something we may be able to consider, because it is not a net gain to the state. Expanding Medicaid expansion. I'm under no illusion of that. We'd still have to come up with the 10% match. My contention is we should be able to use some of the CARES Act to put this into place, and that could be part of our 1115 application waiver. Those are my broad-based question on the governor's office consideration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Sweeney. Who wants to tackle that one? Mr. McKay.
Mr. Chairman, thanks. A couple of things on that topic. One is that there continues to be more guidance coming in from Treasury related to how CARES Act can be spent. So it is possible that could be on the table going forward. We don't have that one has not been spelled out yet, but I think you're probably on the right track that it's unlikely. So we'll have to see what happens there. I think the only other comment I'd make is that I think we should be expecting the cost of Medicaid to go up based on what's happening from the forecast that we've seen from the Department of Health. That really won't be seen for a few more months, probably towards the end of the year. So while we're trying to cut some budgets, we're also going to have rising expenses in some other areas, and that's going to be one of them.
Thank you. Anybody else? Anybody else on the committee? Anybody else? Not seeing any. Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And so somewhat of a question, but more of a statement. The Power Wyoming Group is really as interested as the next decade is just the next kind of 2-year window for our current biennium. And we talked a lot this morning when we talked about our current biennium and the dire situation we're in. And we had some discussion on, well, maybe we could stop some tips or some reserves or not cash out on our investments. But the overall structural problems in our budget will remain even after we find whatever solution we can find for the immediate term. The projections long-term are still very difficult. And so I think we heard this morning with Mr. Richards saying one option is spending down the entire LSRA, the rainy day fund of the state, over the next 1.5 years. But then we are still in a structural deficit with no options on the table. And so if we could, I guess my question is if there's any more discussion on what kind of the long-term prognosis is, if the governor's office has any more beliefs on once we get through the current biennium crisis we're in, anything that they believe, through the rest of the 20s, here, what Wyoming's future is and what we could maybe work on together in planning that out. Because it's not only an immediate problem, we're talking about a decade-long problem here on how we fix our budget. And I'm not sure if there's a question in there, but if they have any response to those thoughts of the immediate problem and then the next decade before us that still certainly looks like we're on a downslide without a solution, where we go from here.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. You guys.
I think your co-chairman said it exactly right about the role of Power Wyoming. So with you asking Power Wyoming to present today, that isn't the group that has been tasked to try to solve the problem over the next couple of weeks for what solutions there are. So to Representative Connolly's earlier question, the Power Wyoming is going to be separate from that discussion. That will be led by the governor and this office about what solutions we put on the table, and you definitely expect leadership on that issue. So again, I think Chairman Zwanitzer hit it right about what Power Wyoming will be doing, and that is what happens with those discussions that are in the short term. I think trying to tap into some economists and other experts from inside and outside of state government to give us some sort of analysis to say, if you do that now, expect this to be the long-term impact. And we're going to try to grow our economy over this decade through this challenge and emerge from it with strength. How does that look? So I'd say that's what you can expect from Power Wyoming, is that look at the rest of the decade more and less about what happens over the next few months.
Thank you. Anybody?
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
If I may, one thing I would say too is, because I think your co-chair Zwanitzer was asking about the governor's office, and I think the one thing I want to emphasize, we're looking at everything. We have to be looking at everything for us at this juncture. With revenue and cuts, it's got to be a melding of both. But I think to the Power Wyoming and to what we're doing in this office and to what your committee's doing, it is absolutely integral that we are communicating to our constituents, getting this down in the coffee shops, getting it on Main Street, just the absolute severity of this problem. That the livelihood that we've all enjoyed here in Wyoming, having a mineral-based revenue structure, it's a changing dynamic. We're going to have to be willing to take a bigger load of the tax burden as individuals. And I think that's just a reality, but we need to communicate that. I think we have a tendency to, and I think the constituents have a tendency to think that everything that we do here in government is is within this bubble. And we have to get outside of that bubble. We have to go out and talk to the constituents, and the constituents in turn are responsible for electing the people who are going to lead the state moving forward.
Thank you, Mr. McVeigh. Senator Biden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McVeigh, thank you for your testimony. What has the governor's office done about talking about growing the economy? I mean, if we have economic growth, that'll obviously spur more revenues coming in through sales and use taxes. I haven't heard anything this morning about the plan to grow the Wyoming economy and grow our GDP. If you could expound on that, that'd be great. Thanks.
Sure.
Mr. McKay.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Senator Biden, I think absolutely that's part of what Power Wyoming is going to do is to look at what are the strategies and policies we need to grow our economy as we emerge from this. So the Business Council has a new CEO who I think we feel very excited about. They've got a new strategic plan. And I think that layers onto this very well because they're looking at pillars of the economy to look at what our strengths are now. And now we need to factor in what are the changing trends that are happening globally, nationally, and regionally that we can capture to grow the economy. So definitely there's plenty of that happening. I think that is all we do here is trying to figure out how you grow the economy to that strength. But I think what Mr. McVeigh is trying to get at too is that we also have to educate people that to things you know so well, senators, is that if we bring in somebody in a diverse business today, it costs the state money. That was under the old paradigm and our old economy that was around last year. That was the factor. So and it still applies. I think we have to deal with that reality, and we have to make sure people know that if you attract somebody to Sheridan and they start a small business, that may create jobs to the economy. But if they've got kids, the energy industry is paying for all the services that family receives. So we have to get that information out to the public so that they have a better understanding about it. So as we grow our economy, we have a growing, strong economy, and we also have growing revenue that comes with it to fund the things that we all choose. Does that mean we're not going to make hard choices over the next few months and we're going to give up some services? I think absolutely we're going to be making enough cuts that are so noticeable that we give up services, we give up programs that many of us support and believe in, but that we have to prioritize to make it through this next 28 months is as the Craig shows, but probably the entire decade.
Anybody else? Anybody else? Not seeing anybody on the committee. Oh, Representative Roscoe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My applauds to the governor's office. But I was just wondering if the Power Wyoming is going to focus or communicate to our constituents the need for infrastructure for such as highways, education, to encourage future investment because the free markets are changing, and I just think that would be important. Are you going to concentrate on that? Thank you.
Mr. McKay.
Mr. Chairman, I think yes is going to be part of that, but it is also part of the Business Council's strategy long-term too, about looking at what infrastructure is needed to attract businesses here.
Anybody else on the committee? So before we go to public comments on this topic, I think we just kind of have to look at all this in perspective a bit. And I applaud the governor, his office, for bringing Power Wyoming forward last year before this crisis. And it was brought about because of a recognition that our economy was changing. What we were selling was changing in the world. And we had to begin to anticipate the magnitude of those changes as well as begin to prepare for them. And so, I mean, it was very timely, very appropriate, and it just continues now. It's not the short-term fix for everything because it is by definition a long-term exercise. But I want to plant a seed with everyone here. Based on work that the Revenue Committee did, and was really our previous chairman, to show and have an analysis that our economic development efforts weren't bringing in parity of tax efforts. And that while, of course, we want more people in Wyoming, we want vigorous, healthy families, we want all that. But the tax burden, as our economy shifts, is not being taken up by our new economic contributors. And so, I mean, I'll throw it out for you guys. I'm not sure that we can fundamentally successfully transition our economy in the next 2 to 10 years without transitioning our tax structure to match it. It just seems impossible to me. And that's kind of the economist in me coming out. But I just throw that out and we can think about it, and maybe some public comment on this. We'll have some discussion about that, but I'll throw it back to the governor's office if they wish to comment on that or not, and you don't have to.
Mr. Chairman, just a quick comment. I think this is, to your points, excellently laid out there. I couldn't agree with you more on that. And that was our concern initially when Endow was first going, that they would not have any, that they didn't want to engage in any discussion about tax structure, only promoting economic development. I mean, like, you know, you can't have one without the other, especially given the limited, the very basic tax structure that we live under. It was just, I think it was such a refreshing thing to have Dr. Liu with economic analysis put out those charts that really portrayed it best. You know, who's really paying the taxes in Wyoming, and if we're going to push a new economic growth, given our current tax structure, we absolutely must diversify it in the same manner we do our economy.
Mr. McVeigh, Senator Ellis, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this question's for Buck. Is the governor's office starting to categorize or collect a list of regulatory changes that we can at least start considering? And I know this isn't a revenue question, but as we're talking about businesses coming back online, my biggest concern is that government's going to start trying to take action to replace functions that are normally done by the private sector. And so I am curious to know if we are looking at our regulatory structure and if the governor's office is compiling that, so we at least know what would provide some incentive and relief for our businesses to get back online.
Thank you, Senator Ellis. Anybody want to tackle that, please?
Mr. Chairman, I would just add to that certainly as we're looking at regulatory measures on our oil and gas and our extractive industries, that has been being looked at very, very hard. We recognize the fact that our regulatory structure is and can be very much an impediment to business here in Wyoming. So we're constantly looking at that, from oil and gas commission to certainly from public utilities, all of it. So I don't know if Rennie has business permitting. I think that's another big one that within the business council, they're really looking to help streamline, as is the Secretary of State, trying to make a one-stop shop for for businesses coming in. So I'll defer now to Rennie if he has any.
Mr. Chairman, the only thing I'd add there too is we also have lots of conversations with federal agencies to try to encourage those federal agencies that provide so much of the regulatory framework for so many of our industries to see how they can operate and provide suggestions and advocate for streamlining of those, especially as we manage this crisis and companies need to act quickly and nimbly. So I think there'll be a discussion as we go forward as well, more broadly about what's lasting. And I think that's one of the silver linings to this is that we've been able to look at how we do business and try to be more efficient and be more nimble to manage a crisis. And now we can see how many of those can be carried over and be permanent changes.
Thank you. Anything else from the committee? I was going to open it up for public participation if there is any. So, Mr. Co-Chairman, anybody in Cheyenne?
No, Mr. Chairman, but I did enable YouTube comments, but there are none either this time. But we do have 250 people watching.
Lucky them. Feel sorry for them. Anybody in the waiting room? And then
No, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Katie. Thank you very much. Anybody in Lander? We've got several people in the audience. Looks like they're, and I might point out some of the people in the audience here are from local government. And our earlier discussions were really about state impacts, but unfortunately, I think impacts to local government are even going to be more significant, perhaps. And they have fewer tools to deal with those impacts. So maybe as we move forward into our next agenda item, which really is to review kind of what our options are, we can definitely keep local government in mind. I've got people from the county here, and I've got people from small towns that are heavily reliant. Towns are heavily reliant on sales tax. Counties are a little bit more insulated because they have property tax as a basis, and there is that lag built in. So they don't have any options really. We gave them a little bit of an option with a local option sales tax. But if we consider adding sales taxes at the state level, that'll probably make it harder for them to achieve success with the local option. So committee, the next item is really looking at the budget shortfall and review of recent revenue options, then the budgeting process and its requirements, getting some discussion from agencies, committee discussion, public comments, kind of a more of a free-for-all. And so, Mr. Co-Chairman, how do you want to proceed on this one? You're on mute, I think.
I'm happy to start with Mr. Noble and see where the conversation directs us. And then if any committee members have comments, I have some information. We also have a similar topic tomorrow morning, I think after the shock wears off. So, but if Mr. Noble has some comments, and then we can kind of jump into what different options are. I think there's some LSO fiscal people also on the Zoom, and they may wish to testify as well, or we could direct questions to them regarding the fiscal structure and what some of our revenue streams can do, the taxation schemes, et cetera.
That's a good plan, Mr. Co-Chairman. Thank you. And I see Representative Sweeney has his hand up.
Mr. Chairman, just a technicality. So there hasn't been anybody in the weight room. Do people know? I don't know how you would get in the weight room. And then on YouTube, I've always found in watching Management Council, how do you get into the chat? And I'm just wondering if there's any members of the public actually out there that can't figure out how to get in. That's just me. So I just wanted to address that before we went too much further.
Thank you very much, Representative Sweeney. Excellent points. And Mr. Co-Chairman, help me out too. But in order to schedule yourself and get in the weight room to address the committee on an issue, you were required to notify the LSO prior to this meeting. I'm not sure how well it can be handled ongoing, but so there were many people that did indicate they wish to address the committee on different subjects, not so many on these very general subjects. That was one of the reasons we had the in-person meeting in Cheyenne and in Lander, so we could accommodate spontaneous comments. As to the chat feature on the YouTube video, I think Mr. Co-Chairman said that he's enabled it, so it is on. And that might be a way to put something forward. Management Council early on had not enabled that. They tried it and then took it off. And then when Mr. Co-Chairman and I, along with the minority and majority leaders, held a listening session, we were very adamant to leave that chat feature on and go through it. I think there is some concern among our leadership that the chat feature is not the best way to kind of convey it. It has a lot of ups and downs to it. Let's just say that. And a lot of fan club type stuff and a lot of pithy comments and things, but I'm okay with that. I'm okay with everybody seeing that, but I know that Mr. Co-Chair is monitoring it for us right now, and he can bring anything in that he sees from that. Mr. Co-Chair, can you add anything else about how people participate?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thanks. Originally this morning, it was not enabled. And so if you're watching on YouTube, you may have to refresh your browser, but there are multiple people testing it out right now and say it is working. So if any worthwhile comments come into the committee, I will certainly pass those on or bring them into the conversation from the YouTube channel.
That would be great, Mr. Co-Chairman. Just get my attention and I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Sweeney. So I think the plan was to go to Mr. Noble. Is that what to start with? Mr. Noble, thanks for waiting. You're very patient.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. Dan Noble again with the Department of Revenue. I'm not really sure how you wanted to proceed with this, so I will outline what I remember as revenue generation topics that have been discussed over the years and see if that stimulates conversation. Would that be a good way to proceed?
I think that's great. That was sort of what I was prepared to do too, but go ahead.
Okay. All right. I think probably the easiest is to approach the taxes that we have today. And some of the things we've looked at there, one of them was to look at the sales tax and either expand the list of items that we actually tax by either looking at exemptions that are currently on the books, or to raise the rate, or potentially expand the base to tax services and things that we don't currently tax today. We've also looked at property taxes, either increasing mill levies strictly for school funding of schools, or by looking at raising the assessment ratio to increase the value, if you will, that is subject to taxation. Both of those have been discussed a couple of times in the last few years. We have looked at expanding or raising the fuel tax, either strictly on a cents per gallon basis, and I think that there was discussion held about whether to index it as well. We have done that once in the last few years. I think there's a 10 or 11 cent increase in the tax. We have looked at alcohol taxes in the state to determine whether or not there should be an increase in the taxes, the excise taxes on wine, spirits, and beer. We have looked at tobacco tax increases over the last as many years as I've been here. I think we've looked at that. It has been raised in the early 2000s from I think it was 12 cents per stick or per package to 60 cents per package, and it has not been raised since then. We have changed the way that we value moist snuff those are the existing taxes. We have also looked at a corporate income tax and an individual income tax, and determining whether or not that would be feasible for the state. Let me see, trying to think of anything else. There has been discussion about severance tax, how to change it. We have a bill in place today, House Bill 159, actually changed from the current payment schedule for ad valorem taxes on minerals to a monthly payment schedule, and that will phase in over a number of years. I think those are the things that I can recall as far as tax issues. When it comes to tax structure, we've conducted a REMI modeling of what our current tax structure does as you add a new business to it, and it kind of pointed to the fact that it widens the structural deficit by actually bringing in new businesses. And I think a number of different issues were discussed as it relates to how we diversify our economy and how that is impacted by the tax structure that we currently have in place. That's what I remember from our discussions over the years. Obviously, there was an awful lot more to it associated with what type of revenue it would raise, what the administrative costs would be, and other issues. I failed to mention the chairman's tax on either wind energy or on electric generation as well. And that was discussed and has been discussed over a number of years. And with that, I'll stand for any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Noble. Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Noble. And I don't know if you know these numbers off the top of your head, but generally, could you say where Wyoming is in comparison to the country and or our neighboring states with our property tax rates and our sales tax rates? I think that's important.
Actually, I have a document. I think it is to be presented later on under tax studies that have been done.
You're not going to steal Don Richards' presentation, are you?
I'm looking for it right now. Let's see if I can find it. Let's put it this way. I approached this two different ways. I looked at what the state of Wyoming would look like as it relates to states that do not have an income tax. And then I looked at our surrounding states, and I have those documents for you. I just don't have them with me, but I can certainly search for them and provide them. And I think I'm about to lose my laptop, so I'm going to switch to my other computer.
Go ahead. So just by way of answering the co-chairman's question, I believe Wyoming's sales tax rate is lower than most neighboring states. Of course, Montana does not have a sales tax rate at all. We're often compared with South Dakota, and South Dakota's rate is roughly equivalent. It's a little bit higher. We pointed out in the past that Wyoming has many, many more things that are exempted from sales tax that are taxed in South Dakota. With respect to the property tax, I know that Mr. Noble in the past has made the point that South Dakota's property taxes are substantially larger than Wyoming's, and it's, I believe, more than double off the top of my head.
Yes.
Mr. Noble, are you back? Did I do okay?
You did fine. I'm still limping along on this computer, but you're right there. One of the things that I will point out, while South Dakota, their sales tax is, I believe, 4.5% at the state level. They do not share that with local government. So the state's actual tax is that entire 4.5%, and it raises for state revenues roughly $1 billion a year.
Thank you, Mr. Noble. Representative Conley, I saw that you had your hand up. And let me, before we get there, did you have anything to follow up, Mr. Co-Chairman?
Oh, I know that Mr. Richards and Mr. Anderson from LSO also have a presentation to talk about some of this with us when you're ready, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, and they have great specificity on that. Representative Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess to start with, I'd just like to add, I think we've passed a modest lodging tax as well last year, and we allowed for kind of an optional municipal tax. So those were new things. But I'm curious, Director Noble, have we ever looked at a real estate transfer tax? And in particular, one that maybe had like a couple of tiers to it, where we would exempt a transfer under, let's say, $500,000, so that we're not looking at, for example, your basic residential property. But have we ever looked at that?
Mr. Noble.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Representative Conley, it has been discussed in the past, and I believe that the model that was presented was a somewhat of a tiered structure. Lower rates at a lower amount. As a matter of fact, I believe there was even an exemption for the first. I don't remember exactly how low it was, but an exemption for a low amount. It is something that we've addressed in the past. As a matter of fact, it was actually one of the things that was presented.
Hold on, Mr. Noble, if you can hear me. I think we're having issues with you switching your computer. And so just bear with us for a moment.
I'm back. I think I'm back.
You are back.
Okay. I just lost my computer, so I'm on to a new one. I don't know what I missed there, but I guess the point is we have addressed it in the past. The Tax Reform 2000 Committee actually made the recommendation to explore a real estate transfer tax as one of their recommendations. And I know of probably 3 separate occasions it's been discussed in the past during my tenure.
Okay. Who's next? Who's next? Anybody? Representative Blackburn.
Looked at.
There you go. Too many people hitting your mute button. Okay.
Am I there?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Noble, I just wonder if we have ever in the past looked at something similar to a head tax for funding schools. I guess some of my constituents have asked me about a head tax per student. Have we ever looked at anything like that at all?
Mr. Chairman, I believe it's been discussed in the past, and I think it was something that was looked at. It wasn't looked upon favorably when we were discussing Tax Reform 2000, but it was looked at as part of the Tax Reform 2000 Committee as something that was out there. I believe that at the time Arizona had a head tax that they were looking at. I don't know whether they actually passed it or not, but it was, the concern was that it's difficult on businesses. Now I don't know whether you mentioned it being on a per student basis. I'm not, this was the business taxes that I think were looked at were actually a head tax on employees that were employed by businesses. So I don't think it was ever discussed as it relates to an educational issue. So I'm not sure how that would work, but I don't think it was discussed in that context. It was discussed as a head tax on employees, and that's typically how it's done from what my experience with it is.
Any follow-up? Okay. So do we have some staff presentations? Is that what I understand? Would this be a good time? Mr. Richards, are you?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we do have a presentation. I will kick it off, and then I believe Josh Anderson, Dean Tempty, and Ted Hewitt also have maybe 5 minutes each within this presentation if the committee so desires.
Thank you, Mr. Richards. The floor is yours.
hopefully I'm sharing your screen. I will address the first few slides here.
It's working well.
Okay, thank you. The categories of response options, and we're speaking a bit more broadly than just taxation. The first one is budget cuts, and we phrase this as program reductions, inclusive of replace support. So we would include the 1% severance tax as a swap in that first category. The second category is the use of reserves, the LSRA, the SIPA, use of reversions, or as Kevin Hibbert indicated, carryover, I think was his language. The third option is what if Congress changes either the flexibility for the use of current CARES Act funds or provides additional federal stimulus. The fourth category is increased revenues. And like the prior three categories, this is not just limited to increased taxes. As Senator Biteman and Senator Ellis indicated, providing a robust, strong, vibrant economy. If there are opportunities to reopen the economy and provide additional tourism and support for activities such as Frontier Days mentioned by the Director of Department of Revenue, that would of course generate additional income. Additionally, the Select Committee on Capital Finance and Investments, as well as the Joint Appropriations Committee, have revamped, along with the Treasurer and former Treasurer and current Governor, the investment of state funds. I would remind the committee that a 1% increase on our two permanent funds generates $240 million per biennium. So to the extent additional revenue can be generated from investments, that would also address a portion of the potential shortfall. Next, we have looked at the fiscal impact of just the major revenue enhancements. The first, fourth, and fifth items have been calibrated consistent with the new Craig report. So the 1% severance tax would generate, or excuse me, 1% sales and use tax would generate 150 million. That comes off of just over $200 million from the prior estimate. Elimination of exemptions or the inclusion of taxation on food would generate $186 million. These are annual amounts for fiscal year 2022. And the taxation of food is estimated of 57 million, and that is embedded in the 186. It's not in addition to. Both of those numbers are the total amount. So if there is a desire to split that 50-50 or 1/3, 2/3 with local governments, the amounts would be reduced or proportioned accordingly. 1 mill levy on the current Craig projection generates $17 million. An increase in the assessment ratio on commercial, agriculture, residential property by 2% from 9.5% to 11.5% is estimated to generate about $110 million per year. As I mentioned, I'm now on the second column or third column at the top. And I mentioned the 1% increase in investment return on either the PMTF or the Common School Permanent Land Fund generates $120 million combined per year, or $240 million for the biennium. The corporate tax, as envisioned by 2020 House Bill 64, would have generated $23 million per year, whereas an individual income tax, as envisioned by 2020 House Bill 147, was estimated.
Pardon me. Did you mean to change your slide? I'm not sure.
I'm sorry, I should be on slide 3. Is that not showing up?
It's showing, but it's, okay, I'm looking at the second column. I was confused. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm actually on the second side of the sheet now. And the first two here were increased investments. And then we have the corporate tax and the individual income tax as envisioned by 2020 House Bill 147.
Thank you.
And then finally, a 1-cent fuel tax, and that's with the exemptions, as well as reduced travel because the procurement of gasoline and to some extent diesel fuel has been reduced in the current economic environment. If I could move to slides 4, 5, and 6 are just a brief discussion of de-earmarking. And this was a 1999 subcommittee of the Revenue Expenditure Study. I believe the first meeting that I recall was chaired in Lander at the old courthouse by former Representative Harry Tipton. And they recognized a significant downturn in the 1990s and recalibrated, reorganized the government finances, liquidated some reserve accounts, combined other reserve accounts. And the big takeaway is that last bullet, they capped revenue in exchange for certainty for the water account, certainty for local governments in the form of counties and municipalities, as opposed to a risk-based formula. And these next two slides illustrate the severance tax distribution. And in the center here, we have the $155 million cap, or under the cap. Even under Craig's pessimistic or low revenue scenario that was issued this morning, all of those recipients are anticipated throughout the projection period over the next 5 years, are anticipated to receive the full funding under the cap of 155 million, which means the budget reserve account and the general fund bear 100% of the reduction of severance taxes and FMRs. But we're very close. So we are teetering on this $155 million after you take out the PMTF and the 1% non-constitutional deposit to the PMTF. We are teetering on hitting that limit of $155 million. That has never been at risk since it was imposed in the first part of the current century. Same issue applies in federal mineral royalties, where under no circumstance under the current formula are any of these entities at risk on their FMRs. However, as discussed this morning, to the extent the BLM or Congress modify royalty rates, these are the entities that would be at risk. And I would note in particular the University of Wyoming, and you gave them an additional $8 million, so they're actually receiving about $22 million. They are potentially the most at risk because they have bonds outstanding that are in part leveraged against those FMR payments. So I'm not familiar with any bonds outstanding by the School Foundation Program or Highway Fund or other entities, but UW, to the extent FMRs go below the $200 million cap, could be at risk. With that, I will pause and turn it over to Councillor Anderson.
You bet. And just a little housekeeping. People have texted me and said that they were not able to get the chat feature to work on until they rebooted their computer, basically got out of the program and came back in. So I think that echoes what Mr. Co-Chairman said. So who's next? Mr. Temke or Mr. Anderson?
Mr. Chairman, Josh Anderson, LSO. This document I'm going to refer to, it's in the meeting materials online. You can find it. It's document 5-01. I'm going to say it's a little bit duplicative with what Director Noble said, and with slide 3 of Mr. Richards' recent presentation. But what this was is just a summary of recent bills and other discussions that this committee has had over the last few years with the relevant estimates. Note a couple caveats before I start here. You know, this isn't intended to be comprehensive of all the potential options that could be considered, such as the real estate transfer tax that was mentioned earlier, and other things. It's simply just a kind of summary of what this committee's looked at for your convenience. So that's all in one place with the relevant estimates. And then the second caveat then is that these estimates were under previous fiscal information before all these recent history. So it would, if we were to pursue these, you would get updated estimates, but that's not included here. So just a quick walkthrough, Mr. Chairman. The fuel tax, what we introduced a bill in 2020 3-cent in fuel tax for about $13 million per year. That would go to the highway fund, not to the general fund. Then, Mr. Chairman, the corporate income tax, note that that estimate would be heavily dependent on how that is imposed. This is based off of the national corporate tax recapture, roughly $23 million per year. There was an income tax bill that was discussed, again, heavily dependent on the details of how that tax is imposed. The last one in 2020 was an estimate of roughly $115 million per year. The next three options discussed in the memo are related to sales tax. The first two are kind of very related, expanding the sales tax to services and then removing the sales tax on exemptions. Sometimes those are discussed together. We've discussed them in both ways, so I separated them out here. Expanding the sales tax to services, roughly $114 million per year, again, depending on how you define services. And then removing sales tax exemptions, other sales tax exemptions, approximately $71 million per year. There's additional document in the materials, 5-03 from the Department of Revenue that provides much more detail on how they got to those numbers and that estimate for your information. Next, Mr. Chairman, again, related is just an increase of the sales tax rate, a 1% increase, roughly $140 million per year to the general fund, with $63 million to local governments. Next one, Mr. Chairman, was a couple years ago, we discussed an increase to the school mills for school funding. That was a phase-in of 3 mills per year for 9 additional mills. The estimate when that was fully implemented was $104 million per year. Next, Mr. Chairman, tobacco tax increase. Recent bill in 2019 was a $1 per cigarette, per pack of cigarettes tax increase and related proportional increases to the other tobacco taxes. That was approximately $31 million per year to the general fund. Another one we've discussed recently, a wind tax increase. This was in 2019, an increase from $1, the current $1 per megawatt hour to $5 per megawatt hour. It's approximately $17 million per year. The next two are related to alcohol. There was a bill we did in 2018, which was to increase the markup amount from 17.6% to 20.6%. That would raise approximately $3,000 or $3 million per year. Then an increase in alcohol taxes that was discussed by the committee, but not ultimately a bill drafted. Currently, the state does about $2 million per year on our alcohol taxes. So if those were to be doubled, for example, that would be $4 million per year. Liquor division provided a document. I don't know if that was forwarded to the committee or not, with some detail on how that breaks down between malt beverages, wine, and spirits. We can certainly get that out to the committee. Finally, last couple, Mr. Chairman, then we've discussed recently an increase to the property tax assessment ratio, increasing the ratio on the all other property category. From the current 9.5% to 10.5% would be approximately $58 million per year. I just note there that in our recent discussions, we didn't pursue the increase in industrial property due to the impacts that might have on mineral production, but we can certainly get that estimate to you if you would like. And then finally, Mr. Chairman, has been discussed in various circles is an increase of the severance tax rate, and a 1% increase would be approximately $93 million. With that, I stand for any questions or turn it back over to Don or Dean.
Thank you very much, Josh. So it's interesting. We're facing a very big problem, and a lot of the taxes that you mentioned were relatively modest amounts. They might have seemed like quite a bit at the time, but really the biggest possible ones, if I understand, are possibly mill levies, maybe the assessment ratio, hefty increases in sales tax, at least current forms. Those are our biggest bang for our bucks. So let's see, Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question on the increased property tax assessment ratio. When you said other, does that drill down to basically commercial and residential? Is that what you're considering as other?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, that's correct. It's residential, commercial. So there's three categories. It's mineral production, industrial, and then all other. And
okay.
And Department of Revenue can probably provide more info if you want more detail.
No, that's perfect. I just wanted to make sure I was not missing something. Thank you.
And let's just remember that agricultural is based on the ability to produce. And that's in our Constitution. Larson, how are you? Representative Larson. Got to unmute you.
There we are. I had a little trouble. Mr. Chairman, thank you. Did we get a handout on that from Mr. Anderson and I cannot find it? Or was that all verbal?
I think it's on our meeting materials. Mr. Anderson, back.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, yeah, it's in your meeting materials that Katie sent. It's also available online. It's document 5-01 if you want to look in the online meeting materials.
Thank you. Who else? Anybody else at this point? All right, who's next? We've got big brains. I see Dean getting ready. Mr. Temke, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Dean Temke. I work in the budget fiscal section of LSO. I was going to continue the presentation that Don had started. You can see the slide before you is just a snapshot of the major components of Wyoming's tax structure. This slide is an update of a slide I presented to the Revenue Committee back in 2017 at the Saratoga meeting. As this slide shows, Wyoming's tax structure does have a three-legged stool, one being property taxes, one being general sales taxes, and one being severance taxes. As you can see from the slide, the largest contributor is property taxes. As you see by the first bullet under that particular line, though, mineral production contributed almost half of that amount in FY19. If you look at the Craig forecast that Mr. Richards presented this morning, that contribution from mineral production has dropped quite a bit with the new forecast. It's closer if you compare the assessed value of mineral production to total assessed value on table 9. That amount is more like 30% now. So that's one place where you can see the big drop in revenues that we've been talking about. The next biggest contributor is general sales taxes. This is the 4% state rate plus average local pennies. A lot of the information presented on this slide is information from the Tax Foundation. They put out a document each year called Facts and Figures, and this is from Facts and Figures 2020. You can see that our state rate of 4% is the 40th highest. So it's certainly one of the lower rates. And actually, to clarify that point, there are actually 5 states that have a 0 rate. And there is only one state that has a state sales tax rate that is lower than Wyoming's, and that is Colorado, with a state rate of 2.9%. Wyoming is ranked 40th, tied with 4 other states. So while it looks like Wyoming is not quite at the bottom, the 4% state rate is the second lowest in the nation for those states that have a state sales tax. As you can see, the next largest contributor, at least in fiscal year 2019, was severance taxes. Again, Mr. Richards' presentation of the updated forecast showed a precipitous drop in severance taxes. So basically, if you look at our 3 largest contributors, 2 of them are taking actually, you could say all 3 of them are taking a pretty big hit, just because property taxes was made up by almost 1/2 of mineral production. Severance taxes is all mineral production, and sales taxes, while there are other contributing sectors to our general sales taxes, mineral production is even a significant contributor to that one as well. The biggest takeaways from this slide, I think, are just the taxes in place in the state of Wyoming are ranked pretty low when compared to our neighboring states, and especially in the comparison of all 50 states. You can see fuel tax is the 36th highest, cigarette tax is the 43rd highest. We have the lowest beer tax in the nation. However, as you had mentioned, Mr. Chairman, some of these items can contribute much more revenue to the state's financial picture than others. The biggest point on this, another big point that this slide ends with is currently there's no individual income tax or no corporate income tax in the state of Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. Temke. And I'd be remiss, I always try to make the point that on our alcohol tax, agree 100% on the beer being the lowest in the country. But Wyoming does tax wine and spirits, but we also have an 18% markup. And we did flirt with raising that markup, I believe, at one time a few years back. So I'll just point that out.
Mr. Chairman, Chairman Case, thank you for mentioning that. Yes, the Revenue Committee did consider increasing the current, that profit percentage that is added to wine and spirits, which does benefit the general fund. It's currently 17.6%. The Revenue Committee sponsored a bill to increase that from 17.6% to 20.6%. I believe that may have been in the 2019 session.
That's right. Thank you, Mr. Temke. You have good memory. Okay, keep going.
The next slide, slide number 8. This is just a good snapshot comparing Wyoming's rates to all of our surrounding states, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Utah. And as you can see, even our largest contributors, sales tax, sales and use tax, property tax, 2 of our largest contributors, our effective rates, our tax rates are among the lowest. The only neighboring state that has a lower sales tax than we do is Montana, who has no state sales tax. However, they have an income tax to replace it. And interestingly enough, in the last comparison with Wyoming with other states, Montana's income tax contributed the same percentage as Wyoming's sales tax. So they just made a choice to go in a different direction for one of the 3 legs of their stool. I know one thing that Director Noble has mentioned frequently is the state of South Dakota. Now, you will notice that the state of South Dakota is similar to the state of Wyoming. They have no individual income tax and they have no corporate income tax. However, a couple things you will notice, they assess property taxes at over twice the rate that Wyoming does currently. Another thing you will notice is their total sales tax is quite a bit higher than Wyoming's total sales tax, combined state and local as well. Not only are the rates higher, but I guess you could say South Dakota's sales tax has more breadth to it because it taxes many more items. It has fewer exemptions. It taxes services. So certainly I can see why Director Noble has tried to compare Wyoming with South Dakota in the past in their similarities of having no individual income tax and a corporate income tax, but they are able to make their state revenue picture work with just really two major legs, if you will, the sales tax and the property tax. Both of their relative percentages of the total are quite a bit higher contribution for sales tax and for property tax.
Thank you.
And this slide just shows the last time these taxes, some of the major taxes were increased. The first one says state sales and use tax. That 1993, that is actually the last time that the state sales tax rate increased. It increased from 3% to 4%. That initial imposition in parentheses, I probably shouldn't have put that there. That's a little bit misleading, but 1993 was the year that the state sales tax rate increased from 3% to 4%. You also,
I might add that we promised that it was just temporary to get this through the crisis. And that was my first year in the legislature. And so maybe that's where you're the initial imposition, because it was supposed to be temporary. Of course, never was.
Thank you, Chairman Case. The next item on there, state ad valorem tax. Actually, we do have a state ad valorem tax on the books. The last time it was assessed was in 1969, which was coincidentally the year where Wyoming started assessing severance taxes on mineral production. So that is likely the reason that the state ad valorem tax stopped at that particular point in time. Going down the list, the fuel tax, the last time that was increased was in 2013. In the 2013 session, the fuel tax rate was increased from a total of 14 cents to a total of 24 cents, and 24 cents is the current rate today. The next item is cigarette tax. And during the 2003 session, the cigarette tax was increased from 12 cents a pack to 60 cents a pack. The next item on the list, wind generation tax. The wind generation tax actually went into effect in 2010, and it went into effect at a rate of $1 per megawatt hour. That rate is still currently $1 per megawatt hour. There continues to, as far as the wind generation tax goes, there is also a 3-year exemption, if you will. A wind turbine is only taxed, the megawatts generated by a wind tower are not taxed for the first 3 years of megawatt production. The final tax listed here, severance tax, we have oil and gas in parentheses. 1981 was the last time that the oil and gas severance tax rates were increased. They increased from 4% to 6% in 1981. And oil and gas is still subject to the 6% rate today. However, there is an exemption. It's called the stripper exemption, which is wells which produce less than 10 barrels per day, pay a 4% rate instead of a 6% rate. And Mr. Chairman, I believe at this time, I can take any questions that you might have. Otherwise, Ted will be continuing the presentation.
Let's see if there's any questions. Questions by the committee? Mr. Temke? Anybody? We've got Representative Sweeney. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question back to slide 8. South Dakota corporate income tax. Don't they have a gross receipts tax or something similar?
Mr. Temke?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, I am glad I see Dan Noble's face because he will be able to correct me if I'm wrong. Actually, I believe what you're referring to is just referring to the South Dakota sales and use tax, where they really tax a whole lot more items. I don't know if it's technically considered a gross receipts tax. However, South Dakota certainly has fewer exemptions for their sales and use tax. And as I mentioned before, they also tax services.
Thank you, Mr. Temke. Mr. Noble.
Mr. Chairman, Dan Noble again. I think maybe what is kind of confused as a gross receipt tax is the state of South Dakota imposes a contractor's excise tax, and it's 2% of the revenues associated with any construction project. And that is treated somewhat like a gross receipts tax, if you will, for contractors. And as you know, we tax the materials associated with contracts, but we do not tax the labor. They do, and that's how they do it, is under a gross receipts tax associated with the contractor's excise tax. Sales and use tax is similar to ours. They actually impose the tax on the vendor, as opposed to Wyoming, where we impose it both on the vendor and the taxpayer as well. Equal of them, they're equally imposed on each entity. The kind of a nuance associated with how they impose their tax, but it really ultimately ends up being the same as what we have. But I would say that if you're talking about a gross receipts tax, the closest thing that you could look at would be their contractor's excise tax.
Thank you, Mr. Noble.
Thank you.
And then, Mr. Temke, if you don't mind, more discussion about the ad valorem tax that was put in and then wasn't implemented when we did the severance tax. What was that on?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that state ad valorem was assessed on the value of all state property. In other words, the total assessed value as is reflected on table 9 in the Craig forecast. And I believe it was deposited to the general fund. However, in 1969, it was, compared to today, the amount was pretty small. I believe it was less than $2 million.
So just to clarify a little bit and help me out, that was a source of revenue for the state, whereas property tax almost exclusively is revenue for local governments and schools. So it was a category of property-related taxes that went to the state.
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. As you know, property taxes now, 43 mils of them, if you will, go towards K-12 funding. Rough 12 mil, there's a 12 mil maximum on funding that can go to counties, that counties can assess. There's an 8 mil maximum on cities and towns. There are also special districts. Included in that 43 mils I mentioned is the 12 mil levy that goes directly to the school foundation program account. But you are correct, there are no property taxes that currently go to the state's general fund.
Thank you very much, Mr. Temke.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Noble.
There is actually on the books the ability of the state to impose up to 4 mils it just has not happened for a lot of years. And I think it was around 69 was the last time it was ever imposed. But it is still something that the state has, well, it's looked at, it has never been imposed for years and years.
And Mr. Noble, if I remember, that tax kind of implementation involves the Board of Equalization and probably the executive. It does not involve the legislature. It can be done without the legislature.
Mr. Chairman, it actually is reported to all the counties by the State Board of Equalization on an annual basis. That is correct.
Around any other questions at this point? Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What would 1 mil equal again?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, as Don Richards had mentioned earlier today in his presentation, under the new forecast that came out, 1 mil applied to the statewide assessed valuation from Table 9 would generate roughly $17 million.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I think that's down slightly and could go down further with the lag in the way property tax is derived.
Mr. Chairman, Chairman Case, yes, the total state assessed value before the new forecast that came out today, the ballpark was more in the total state assessed value was more in the $20 billion range, where with the new forecast, it's more in the $17 billion range.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Tempe. Any questions? Who's going to take on the next part? Is it Mr. Hewitt? Welcome, Mr. Hewitt.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, and members of the committee. So I'll take the final part of the staff presentation here. And the LSO was asked to take a look at the question of what does the Wyoming Constitution require the legislature to fund, or what does the Wyoming Constitution require the legislature to set up a system of funding for? And before I get into this presentation, I just want to mention a few caveats to my answers. I took a look through each section of the Constitution to see if it requires the creation of an office or a board, or if it mandates salaries be paid, or if there's some other mandates to provide funding for some activity. I have not attempted to catalog all state statute funding requirements or federal statute funding requirements or any other non-constitutional requirement. So this is largely just contained to the Wyoming Constitution. And the area where we have reasonably clear law on this is in the K-12 school finance area. And in a series of 4 decisions from 1995 to 2008, the Wyoming Supreme Court looked at the legislature's obligation to provide funding to school districts in order to educate the state's youth. And you can see on this slide, number 10, a couple of sections within Article 7, Section 1 and Section 9. And here you have mandates to the legislature. So in Section 1, the legislature is to establish and maintain a complete and uniform system of public instruction, embracing free elementary schools of every needed kind and grade. And then Section 9 requires the legislature to make provision by taxation or otherwise to create and maintain a thorough and efficient system of public schools adequate to the proper instruction of all youth of the state. So in the Campbell decisions, the court looked at that language and other provisions in the Constitution and came up really with a 4-part process for the legislature to follow in order to meet those mandates. And you can see those 4 steps here on slide 11. First, the legislature has to define and specify what is a proper education. And so after the first Campbell decision, the legislature set up the Common Core of Knowledge, the Common Core of Skills in 21.9, 101, and 102, And that sets the content areas that school districts are to provide to students. The legislature has mandated the State Board of Education flesh that out through content and performance standards. Second, the legislature has to establish and maintain a system for providing an equal opportunity for all students to receive this proper education. The Campbell decisions largely focus on the funding aspect of the state system, but other pieces, graduation standards, accountability requirements can come in there as well. But really the third and the fourth steps are relevant here to the committee's question. So the legislature has to determine the cost of implementing the proper education that the legislature has defined. And the legislature has typically, figured that out by hiring legislative consultants and going through a recalibration study. The legislature is mandated to do that at least once every 5 years. And so once it has a sense of what the cost is to provide the education to all students around the state, then it has to adequately fund that. And that has to take into account if education costs more to provide in one district than another, the system needs to account for that. Those are the four basic steps for the state to meet its constitutional requirements. I'll note Representative Hallinan asked about raises provided to school district staff in recent months. And Dawn, I agree with everything Dawn said on the answer to that question, but also note that the legislature provided an external cost adjustment to the school districts in the last budget session. And so some of those raises may reflect that external cost adjustment that included additional funding for salaries. And so, Mr. Chairman, I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions on the K-12 funding obligations of the state, or I can continue on.
Any questions? Any question? Representative Conley. Sorry, I was playing with my screen trying to find you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hewitt, would it be fair to say that other states do that first bullet point that you had on the slide when it comes to kind of education? They kind of look at kind of what is necessary, in fact, even maybe what it would cost. But what makes Wyoming somewhat unique, and in relation to the Campbell decisions, is that we actually follow, what we have found to be the kind of adequate, proper education. And other states just don't do that. Is that a fair assessment of an interpretation of the Campbell decisions?
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
Representative Connolly, that's exactly right. During the 2017 recalibration process, the recalibration committee had the legislative consultants look at the standards of other states around the country in terms of what those school districts and other states were required to provide. And the standards between states are largely the same. Wyoming is largely in line with those other states. But Wyoming is unique in that it has this requirement that the state provide adequate funding for all school districts to be able to provide that education to all students. And it not only includes operations funding, it also includes school facilities funding, because the court held that school districts have to have facilities capable of being used to deliver the proper education that the legislature defines. So yes, Wyoming is unique in that regard.
And I just, Representative Conley and everybody, I feel like we ought to make the point that we actually get national kudos for this. We probably have the most equitable system of funding education, K-12 education in the country. That is a great success story in many ways. one that comes at a lot of costs, and we've enjoyed some good revenues from the mineral industry to do that. But it is by far a hallmark of Wyoming, one of our big successes. Ms. Hewitt, back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll move on to slide 12. And as we move away from the K-12 education realm, things aren't quite as clear. And so I'll largely just be pointing out relevant constitutional provisions for your consideration. First, we'll start out with the criminal justice provisions. So you can see Article 1, Section 14, and the 8th Amendment prohibit cruel and unusual punishment for prisoners. Article 1, Section 16 requires the state to erect safe and comfortable prisons and inspect the prisons and provide humane treatment of prisoners. The U.S. Supreme Court has made clear that states are obligated to provide appropriate care for prisoners, and that includes medical care. And the Wyoming Supreme Court has implied the same in the 1991 Apodaca case. Moving on to slide 13, and more generally to the courts and criminal procedure, Article 5 of the Constitution provides for the creation of the Wyoming Supreme Court, district courts, of the Judicial Nominating Commission, the Commission on Judicial Conduct and Ethics. Certainly the Constitution contemplates that courts are open. It uses that phrase in Article 1, Section 8. And certainly criminal defendants are entitled to a jury trial, a speedy trial. Indigent defendants are entitled to government paid for counsel in most criminal cases. And so the Constitution certainly imposes obligations on the state there. On to slide 14. I think we're on slide 15 there. Thank you, Don. On slide 14, you'll see a discussion of the legislative and executive branches. Of course, Article 3 provides for the operation of the legislative branch. General sessions are mandated by the Constitution. The compensation for legislators is contemplated in the Constitution as well. Article 4 provides for the creation of the Office of Governor, Secretary of State, Auditor, Treasurer, and State Superintendent. And specifically with respect to compensation for legislators and other state officials, the general rule in the Constitution is that for the term of office, the compensation can't be changed for that term. So in the case of the legislature, a legislature can only affect compensation for future legislators, not its own. For public officials, including the governor and others, county officials, city officials, those with terms, a term of office, their salary is set for the period of that term. The legislature can affect future salaries, but not the current term. And so, I think one can say that those current salaries are obligations of the state. County and city governments are contemplated in the Constitution. County officers are contemplated in the Constitution. The Constitution used to refer specifically to sheriffs, county clerks, county and prosecuting attorneys, county treasurers, county superintendents of schools, county assessors, and county surveyors. That was amended out in 1944. But we do know that county clerks are constitutional officers. And so there's an obligation of the legislature there to provide for that. Moving on to slide 15. Of course, we live in a democratic republic. When we reach the age of majority, we have the right to vote. That right is enshrined in Article 1, Section 27, and throughout Article 6. General elections have to happen every even numbered year in November. So that's an obligation of the legislature to provide for. On to slide 16. You can see additional institutions and offices created in the Constitution. I'll add a few potential ones to this list. The Constitution creates a workers' compensation fund. It contemplates administration of that fund. That might be an obligation of the legislature. Article 17 in the Constitution provides for the state militia. So there may be some obligation there to allow for the existence of that. Article 15 requires for the assessment of all lands in the state. So it would make sense that there's perhaps an obligation of the legislature there to provide for that system. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to answer any questions of the committee.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hewitt. Questions? Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to give Ted the benefit of finishing the discussion, his whole presentation. But if you could touch a little bit on some of those educational responsibilities. We know that it's the state's obligation to determine what's in the basket. And after we have been watching the implementation of computer science standards, can you talk to this committee and get them a little bit up to speed about what that means? Because there's a big difference when we look at what's in the basket of goods and skills and what we treat as common or more like core-based learning, reading, writing, versus elective-based, and how maybe we're not quite set up to distinguish between those two and what that means for funding and maybe what the State Board of Education is working on. Just a brief update, because I think that plays into our revenue picture in a pretty significant way.
Mr. Hewitt, if you can.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, that's absolutely right. That's a important topic. I think the Education Committee will look at early next month. And there have been ongoing discussions in the state board regarding, what exactly do content and performance standards look like for the basket of goods. So as I mentioned, the legislature has enumerated content areas in 21.9.101 for what school districts are expected to provide. And the State Board of Education is required to promulgate content and performance standards for those items. One of those items is computer science. The legislature added that to the basket in 2018, I believe. And so there's a big question, about how exactly the state board has to implement those content and performance standards. Whether every content standard has to be taught in each grade level. And there are funding implications to that, in that the more rigorous content and performance standards you have, the more expensive it is to teach students across the state for that standard. So that is a ongoing issue, and it does have financial implications for the state.
I was muted. Any other questions for Mr. Hewitt? Thank you. Anybody else? All right. Anything else from staff on these presentations? So I think it's appropriate to go to public comment. And I do note that, Senator Ellis, I didn't see you.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know who I want to address this to, but I know that something that we like to do on the Revenue Committee is look at the tax structures of other states, particularly our neighboring states, and comparing ourselves to health and how they're doing versus how we're doing. And I think the narrative I always hear is that somehow we're doing something wrong and they're doing something right. And I just want to be clear. I mean, there are definitely trade-offs of the tax structure we have in place that are advantageous, and then there are disadvantages. And I think that can be said about other states. And so I guess what I'm wanting to know is when you look at the health of our rainy day fund, if you look at the per capita basis, we rank #1 because we've saved so aggressively over the years. And when I start looking at how other states have had, or what's in their rainy day funds, they don't fare nearly as well as we do. And so I'm just kind of wondering if we've started an analysis of how COVID has impacted their revenue picture and their state budgeting. And what are they looking at? I mean, we talk about states that don't have sales tax. Are they starting to think about implementing a sales tax? Are we seeing proposals in these states that rely heavily on property taxes, looking at increasing that? I'm just wondering kind of how, since we're comparing so heavily to those states, if we can get maybe a complete picture of some of the drawbacks of their their tax structures and things that we're just maybe not exploring as fully as we need to be in light of COVID.
Thank you very much, Senator Ellis. Mr. Noble, I don't know, are you still close by? Can I?
Yes, I'm here, Mr. Chairman. Have done some research pretty much associated with surrounding states. And as it relates to how COVID and how they're dealing with COVID, I have not gotten to that point. I think probably what I need to do is contact them directly and find out how, what's on the horizon for them as well. This is fairly recent for all of us, and I don't know that we're going to have, an exact picture of what it is that has happened to them. I mean, the research that we've done in the past has basically looked at states that are similarly situated to the state of Wyoming and how they've dealt with it. The reason that South Dakota was changed is because it's roughly the same population demographics. It has the same tax structure with one thing that's missing, and that is mineral industry. They have virtually minimal extractive industries in the state, and it made sense to utilize a state that is similarly structured and see how they deal with it. It isn't necessarily the right answer, but it is one of them. We've also looked at other states that don't have an income tax, Texas being one of them, and looked at their tax structures to say what they look like. But you're right. How the COVID crisis is affecting them is probably going to be unique to each state. And we can certainly take a look at that. We can be part of it. We just haven't done it yet. At least I haven't. And we can certainly look to ramp that up and take a look at it.
And Senator Ellis, I think that is an absolute excellent suggestion. And I think we can speculate a little bit as we drill down into this. And I'll just throw some numbers out there. And I do think we need to look at other states and how they're handling COVID. But we had a different problem going into the COVID crisis in that we were facing a decline in the production of carbon-based minerals, especially coal, of course, which is, let's be clear that coal is on its way out. If Wyoming is still producing coal in 10 years, I might be surprised. Maybe we will, but that is a big driver in this, and coal has been a big part of those reserves that we've built up, and we're not going to be able to count on those. As I look right now at what's happening, that's left us with an oil and gas play, mostly an oil play. We've seen the prices of oil decline by, for a while it was a third or 2/3 or more, but now it's about a half, 50%. Sales taxes based on sales volume. I think that our sales are off considerably, but I don't think they're off 50%. They might be temporarily, but I don't think they're that far off. Property tax, another piece of our stool, has a built-in lag, and of course there's the real estate value, and then there's the mineral values. We know the mineral values will go down in the next 18 months, kind of expected to. We're not so sure what's going to happen to the rest of the property tax values. So just to generalize what that means for other states is that I'm going to guess that states that were more dependent on property and sales tax, for example, as well as other taxes, may fare better over the course of a year than Wyoming in terms of addressing COVID with their current tax structures. This is purely, it's a speculation, and it's an empirical exercise, and I think you have hit the nail on the head that we ought to look into it. Who else has got questions? Okay, now I think there is some public comment, and I need to apologize to Mr. Obermuller. I probably admitted him prematurely, and he probably had to hang around on the screen with all of us, but I hope you don't mind. And welcome, Mr. Obermuller. Thanks for signing up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Great. And don't mind being here with you all. Appreciate the opportunity. I know later we're going to, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, Pete Obermuller, President of the Petroleum Association of Wyoming. Later we're going to talk about ad valorem, and I wanted to stay in my lane on that particular topic. But as the presentation was ongoing about comparative tax rates in Wyoming to other states, I thought it appropriate to talk to the committee really briefly about what that looks like for oil and gas, and with apologies to Senator Ellis that I'm going to continue the comparisons. So in February, Mr. Chairman, the Colorado version of the Legislative Service Office issued a report for their legislative branch regarding the comparative effective tax rates on oil and gas for 9 oil and gas producing states, most of which are Wyoming's direct competitors. California is not on it, and I will, as soon as I'm done here, I will email this to all of you, though it is available publicly on the Colorado Legislative Service Office website. So it's a comparative of production tax, property tax, income taxes, sales and use taxes, essentially the total state and local taxes on oil and gas. And when we aggregate it all together and we talk about Wyoming's tax structure in relation to these other states, that's when we get these rankings that list us as number 1 or 40th or all of that. When you carve out the single industry of oil and gas, those facts are no longer relevant. We simply are, when you carve us out in comparison to other states, it's quite a bit more significant. So according to that Colorado study, the effective tax rate in Wyoming for oil and gas is 10.1%. That is more than double Colorado's and more than triple New Mexico's, and it's the highest of all 9 of those comparative states. For the oil and gas industry, as we're looking at this and thinking about Wyoming's tax structure, simply think that it's important to note that as just another data point regarding the imbalance of our tax code in the state of Wyoming. We've talked about that before. We talked about it during the session before we got into this particular crisis. And we have talked about our tax rate in Wyoming, but at the time we didn't have any other state who had produced a study that verified what we already knew here, and now we do. So as we look towards moving toward the future, in terms of making sure that the state is on solid ground, the conversation you have all had before about ensuring that there is less volatility. This is another data point that shows exactly how reliant the state is on oil and gas revenue. And I simply wanted to point out that when we hear talk about being number 1 for business tax climate in Wyoming, that's pretty much true for every business but oil and gas.
Thank you. Questions for Mr. Obermuller? Any questions? Representative Sweeney. You're muted. There you go.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Obermuller, I may have missed it in your presentation, but did the Colorado study also take into play the sales and use tax element, or was it strictly the severance tax portion?
Mr. Obermuller?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Sweeney, it takes into account production taxes, so severance, property taxes, income taxes, sales and use taxes. So total state and local taxes. Interestingly, it doesn't include federal royalties, and there are states on here, Oklahoma is on here, North Dakota, Texas, others that don't also have federal obligations that Wyoming operators have.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Obermuller, so you said the effective tax rate, the overall aggregated tax rate is 10.1%. Wouldn't a big part of that be because minerals are assessed at 100% valuation? Or isn't that a big reason why that it's much higher than our surrounding states? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Obermuller?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Western, that's essentially true. And again, I'll send this around along with a link. It's a public document, so anybody can check on it. But I don't want to overwhelm you with numbers. But essentially, the bulk of the taxes in oil and gas in Wyoming are from two different sources: property tax and the production tax and the property tax. And property tax is the highest among those. So you're correct. My house is valued at 9.5% of its value. The companies I represent, the minerals, is valued at 100% of their value. It is, I think most of my operators would agree that in terms of the tax burden in Wyoming, the ad valorem tax is the highest burden. And Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence, that triggers my memory of something I wanted to just mention with regard to ad valorem and your very appropriate and correct comments that there is a delay there. I think it's just important for the community to be cognizant of the fact that that delay is important in a number of ways, the issues you raised, but also the delay in terms of a company's cash flow with respect to their ad valorem responsibility. So for instance, this October, because of the legislation you passed, and we'll talk about it later, a company's production from 2019, the first half, part of the first half will start to become due in October. Companies are in a very different situation today or in October of this year than they will be when those minerals were produced. It can happen in the reverse as well, but it's something to be cognizant of as a committee.
Thank you, Mr. Overmuller. I'm cognizant of the time and people's stomachs, but any other comments from the committee? Any others? Representative Roscoe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Obermuller, I was just wondering about the reason that coal and oil are having problems now are not. I mean, can you compare? This is a softball, really. Can you tell me how important our tax rate is compared to the world markets that are going on and the international disputes and just the way the markets are working? Thank you.
Nice try on the science, but I bet he's getting
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Roscoe. I've been around long enough to know there are no such thing as softball from the Wyoming legislature. Yeah, being cognizant of people wanting to have lunch, let me just say this. We talk about this ad nauseum in this committee, but we all know that step number one is you have to have the resource. And Wyoming has the resource. So that's good. Not only do we have the resource, we have it in abundance, and we also have very high quality resource in the Powder River Basin. If you don't have the resource, you're not having any sort of competition or any chance of producing. That's number one. Number two is the price, and it is a global commodity. And so the very best thing that can happen for Wyoming's economy and oil and natural gas in Wyoming is for the price to increase, and you as a committee and legislature and me have no control over that. Third is once you have the resource and you have a livable and profitable price, you have to compete with everywhere else that also has it. And I submit to you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Roscoe, that we are not the most competitive.
Thank you. Anybody else? Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thanks. Slightly off topic, Mr. Chairman, but what's the current, I guess, differential between Wyoming's oil and WTI right now? I know we're going to talk about this more, but are any projections from Mr. Obermuller on what the price of oil might be over the next year? I know everybody else is prognosticating. I thought maybe he might as well.
Mr. Obermuller. We can look up the price comparison. I see he's doing that.
Yeah, I'm looking very quickly, Mr. Chairman. One of the benefits of remote testimony. Regarding the differential, I'll have to actually look into that, and I'll get back to you later today about that. The differential changes, and the differential is very sensitive to various market conditions, and in fact, the differential is sensitive to various company decisions and ability to produce at a lower cost than their competitors. There's a lot going on within the differential that's really kind of hard to put a finger on and talk about in a comprehensive way. But it isn't important. There always is a differential, and it varies a little bit. To the extent that we can close that, and be very beneficial for Wyoming in order to get a better price. But part of it, as I mentioned, the Powder River Basin sweet crude is desirable. It's a high quality crude, so it benefits us to move on that. With respect to your second question, Mr. Co-Chairman, people much smarter than me have future projections of WTI hovering around the mid 30s all the way into March of 2021. Take that for what it's worth.
That's half of what we were hoping for. Anybody else? Mr. Co-Chairman, do you have anybody that wants to testify there? Okay, and
No, Mr. Chairman.
Anybody in Lander? Anybody in Lander? Is there anybody else in the waiting rooms or anywhere? Before we break for lunch, I want to make one point about the issue of the 100% valuation of the mineral resources. There is a logic behind that in that property taxes, you know, on your house. Your house is a standing value. It's worth so much money, and a bit of it is taxed every year. When we tax mineral resources, we tax the production. We don't tax the amount that the mineral companies own and are in the ground that haven't been produced yet. We have talked about doing that in the past, and it seems very, very complicated. So in a way, the 100% valuation of the production amount is a bit of a compromise, I might point out, between taxing a smaller percentage of the entirety of the mineral deposit, which of course is a bit speculative, but it is on their books. So I do point that out, and we can have more discussion about that, but I think there is a little bit of a reason in the madness.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, please.
Mr. Chairman, I only wanted to point out that I wasn't trying to make a value judgment about it. Simply was pointing out the fact of the matter and the effective tax rate. What to do about it is a prudential question, and I appreciate your comments.
Thanks. I think you got to put everything in perspective. So we are scheduled for lunch. I would say come back at, we've got an hour scheduled for lunch. Do you think we can get together at 1:30, or do we need to go to 1:40?
1:40, please, Mr. Chairman.
Got it. Everybody, we'll see you back at 1:40.
And also, Mr. Chairman, LSO would like me to remind everyone that they'll have a different feed on the website and on YouTube this afternoon. So you can close out of the YouTube and the website, and they'll have a different feed up this afternoon.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that. Everybody, thank you very much. See you in an hour.
Should we leave and sign back in?